halfway between the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. On a low desert plateau overlooking the Nile Valley, there is a cluster of ruined pyramids that almost no one visits. They stand in a rough line along the edge of the escarpment, 4 of them visible from the road, their limestone casings stripped away centuries ago, their cores exposed to the desert wind like broken teeth in an ancient jaw. They are not large, they are not famous, they are not impressive in any conventional sense of the word. They do not appear on most tourist itineraries, and the handful of visitors who do make the effort to reach them, driving south from Cairo along the desert road that skirts the western edge of the cultivation, often arrive expecting grandeur and find instead a landscape of erosion and structural collapse and archaeological neglect that seems to have more in common with an abandoned quarry than a royal necropolis. These are the Pyramids of Abusir, the Forgotten Royal Necropolis. They were built by the kings of the Fifth Dynasty of Egypt, a sequence of rulers who came to power roughly a century after the Great Pyramid was completed, and who inherited a tradition of monumental construction that was already, in ways they could not possibly have recognized at the time, beginning to hollow out from within. That phrase, hollow out from within, is not a metaphor. It is a literal description. When the limestone casings of the Abusir pyramids were stripped away by later builders who needed the stone, they revealed something that the pristine exterior had concealed for centuries. The cores of these pyramids were not solid stone. They were rubble, rough-cut blocks, sand, gravel, construction debris, all of it piled together in a mass that had been held in shape by the casing stones, and that began to collapse the moment those casing stones were removed. The Pyramids of Abusir are, in the most physical sense imaginable, monuments that looked permanent on the outside and were compromised on the inside. They are the architectural equivalent of a civilization running on institutional momentum, while the substance that sustained it was quietly being replaced by something cheaper, something faster, something that would not last. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built roughly a century before the Abusir pyramids, contains an estimated 2.3 million blocks of solid limestone, each weighing on average 2.5 tons. The Pyramid of Sahure, the largest at Abusir, contains a fraction of that mass, with a core composed largely of rubble fill bound together with mud mortar. Khufu's pyramid has survived more than 4,500 years, with its basic form intact. Sahure's pyramid, built with such different priorities, has collapsed into a mound that is barely recognizable as a pyramid at all. The comparison is not merely architectural, it is civilizational. Something changed between the Fourth Dynasty and the Fifth. Something shifted in the relationship between the Egyptian state and its most sacred building tradition, and the ruins at Abusir are the physical evidence of that shift, preserved in crumbling stone for anyone willing to look. But here is the paradox that makes Abusir one of the most important archaeological sites in Egypt. The pyramids themselves are ruins, but the documents that were found inside the temple complexes attached to those pyramids are among the most important written records to survive from the entire Old Kingdom. The Abusir Papyri, discovered in fragments across multiple excavation campaigns spanning more than a century of archaeological work at the site, are the oldest known administrative archives in Egypt. They record the daily operations of the pyramid temples in meticulous bureaucratic detail: duty rosters for priests, inventories of temple equipment, schedules of offerings, accounts of supplies delivered and consumed, records of inspections carried out, and repairs authorized. They are, in effect, the operating manuals of the pyramid cult, the documentary evidence of how the Egyptian state maintained its most sacred institutions on a day-to-day basis. And what they reveal is a system of staggering administrative complexity, a bureaucratic apparatus so elaborate and so precisely organized that it makes the rubble-filled pyramids it served seem almost irrelevant by comparison. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what happened at Abusir. You are going to understand why the kings of the Fifth Dynasty built their pyramids with rubble cores instead of solid stone, and what that decision tells us about the long-term trajectory of an entire civilization. You are going to meet the archaeologists who spent decades excavating these forgotten monuments and discovered, buried in the sand beside them, a paper trail that rewrote our understanding of how the Egyptian state actually functioned. And you are going to confront a question that the ruins of Abusir pose with uncomfortable clarity. What happens when a civilization's most visible achievements become facades? When the exterior of permanence conceals an interior of compromise? And when the bureaucracy that maintains the system becomes more elaborate, more expensive, and more essential than the system itself? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. To understand why the pyramids of Abusir matter, and why their ruined condition tells a story far more important than their modest appearance suggests, you must first understand the world that created them. The Fifth Dynasty of Egypt began around 2494 BC, according to the conventional chronology, with the accession of a king named Userkaf. Userkaf was not the son of his predecessor, Shepseskaf, the last king of the Fourth Dynasty. The circumstances of his rise to power are poorly understood, but the ancient Egyptians themselves preserved a story about it. The Westcar Papyrus, a Middle Kingdom literary text now in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, tells the tale of 3 children born to the wife of a priest of Ra, the sun god, who are destined to become kings and to found a new dynasty. The story is mythological rather than historical, but it preserves an important kernel of truth. The Fifth Dynasty represented a religious revolution. The kings of the Fourth Dynasty had built the largest pyramids in history and had associated themselves primarily with the sky god Horus. The kings of the Fifth Dynasty shifted their primary allegiance to Ra, the sun god, and this theological shift had profound consequences for everything they built. Userkaf did not build his pyramid at Abusir. He built it at Saqqara, adjacent to the step pyramid complex of Djoser, a location that associated him with the most ancient royal necropolis in Egypt, and that signaled continuity with the oldest traditions of Egyptian kingship. But Userkaf did something else that was entirely new. He built a sun temple. The Sun Temple of Userkaf, located at Abu Ghorob, a site near Abusir, was a new kind of royal monument, an open-air sanctuary centered on a massive stone obelisk, a squat, broad-based pillar that symbolized the Benben stone, the primordial mound on which the sun god was believed to have first appeared at the moment of creation. The Sun Temple had no enclosed sanctuary. It had no hidden chambers. It was open to the sky, designed to receive the direct rays of the sun, and its central feature was not a burial but an altar, a place of offering where the cult of Ra was maintained by a dedicated priesthood funded by royal endowments. The Sun Temple was, in theological terms, the complement of the pyramid. The pyramid was the king's mechanism for ascending to the sky after death. The Sun Temple was the king's mechanism for worshipping the sky while alive. Together, they formed a paired system of royal monuments that defined the Fifth Dynasty's approach to kingship and the afterlife. The construction of sun temples alongside pyramids had an enormous economic consequence that is essential to understanding the ruins at Abusir. Building a sun temple in addition to a pyramid roughly doubled the monumental building program that each king was expected to complete during his reign. The resources of the Egyptian state, vast as they were not infinite. The limestone quarries, the labor force, the administrative apparatus that organized and supplied the work, all of these had limits. When the kings of the Fifth Dynasty committed themselves to building both pyramids and sun temples, they were stretching those resources across 2 major projects instead of one. Something had to give, and what gave was the quality of the pyramids. This is not speculation, it is visible in the ruins. The Pyramid of Sahure, the second king of the Fifth Dynasty, and the first to build his pyramid at Abusir, was a monument of approximately 78 meters on each side, rising originally to a height of roughly 47 meters. These are respectable dimensions, roughly half the size of the Great Pyramid in linear terms, but representing only about 1/8 of Khufu's monument in total volume. The exterior of Sahure's pyramid was cased in fine Tura limestone, the same brilliant white stone that had been used for the Great Pyramid, and when the casing was intact, the pyramid would have appeared solid, gleaming, and permanent. But beneath the casing, the core was different. Instead of the carefully laid courses of massive limestone blocks that characterized the Fourth Dynasty pyramids, Sahure's builders used a technique that modern archaeologists describe as stepped rubble fill. The core was constructed in a series of rough steps or layers, each one composed of irregularly cut blocks, stone fragments, sand, and construction debris, bound together with mud mortar. The casing stones provided the structural integrity. They held the rubble in place. They gave the pyramid its geometric form. Without them, the core had no ability to maintain its own shape. The British Egyptologist Mark Lehner, who has studied the construction techniques of Egyptian pyramids across the full span of the Pyramid Age more extensively than perhaps any other living scholar, has described the transition from Fourth Dynasty to Fifth Dynasty building methods as a fundamental shift in architectural philosophy. The Fourth Dynasty builders, Lehner argues, conceived of the pyramid as a solid mass, a mountain of stone whose permanence derived from the sheer weight and density of its fabric. The Fifth Dynasty builders conceived of the pyramid as a shell, a geometric form whose permanence derived from the integrity of its outer surface, rather than from the solidity of its interior. The distinction is crucial. A solid pyramid can lose its casing and still retain its basic form, as the Great Pyramid has. A shell pyramid, deprived of its casing, collapses. And that is exactly what happened at Abusir, when the limestone casing stones were quarried away. Probably during the New Kingdom and later periods, the rubble cores were exposed to the elements and began to disintegrate. The pyramids that had appeared as gleaming white geometric forms for centuries revealed themselves as heaps of loose stone, held together by nothing more than gravity and the remnants of dried mud mortar. The architectural fraud, if that is not too strong a word, was exposed. But the word fraud implies intent to deceive, and that may not be fair to the Fifth Dynasty builders. The shift from solid stone to rubble fill was probably not a conscious decision to build inferior monuments. It was an adaptation to changed circumstances, a pragmatic response to the reality that the resources available for pyramid construction had declined relative to the ambitions of the building program. The Fourth Dynasty kings had concentrated the entire monumental output of the Egyptian state on a single project, the Royal Pyramid, and the result was the most massive structures ever built by human hands. The Fifth Dynasty kings divided their monumental output between pyramids and sun temples, and the result was that neither the pyramids nor the sun temples could command the same concentration of resources that had made the Fourth Dynasty monuments possible. The rubble fill technique was faster and cheaper than solid stone construction. It allowed the builders to raise a pyramid to the desired height within the constraints of a building season that might last only a few years, depending on the length of the king's reign. And as long as the casing remained intact, no one could tell the difference from the outside. The compromise was invisible. For centuries, the Pyramids of Abusir looked as solid and as permanent as the Pyramids of Giza. It was only when the casing was removed that the truth was revealed. The site of Abusir itself deserves a moment of attention, because its geography tells part of the story. Abusir sits on the western edge of the Nile floodplain, on a low plateau of Eocene limestone that rises gently above the cultivated land. It is located roughly midway between the Great Pyramid fields of Giza to the north and Saqqara to the south, a position that is both symbolically and practically significant. To the north, the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure dominate the skyline, massive, enduring, and overwhelming in their scale. To the south, the step pyramid of Djoser marks the origin point of the entire pyramid tradition, the place where monumental stone architecture was invented. Abusir sits between these two poles of Egyptian pyramid building. Between the origin and the peak, and the pyramids that were built there represent neither the beginning nor the climax of the tradition, but its long, slow diminution. The kings who chose to build at Abusir were making a statement about their place in the dynasty's hierarchy. Djoser had claimed Saqqara, the most prestigious site. His successors moved north to Abusir, establishing a new royal necropolis that was close enough to Saqqara to invoke its authority, but far enough away to create a distinct identity. The modern archaeological exploration of Abusir begins in the late 19th century, when the site attracted the attention of European excavators who were systematically surveying the pyramid fields south of Giza. The German archaeologist Ludwig Burckhardt conducted the first major excavations at Abusir between 1902 and 1908, focusing on the pyramid complex of Sahure and the neighbouring pyramid of Djoser. Burckhardt was a meticulous recorder whose published plans and section drawings remain essential references for any study of Abusir architecture. His excavation of Sahure's mortuary temple revealed a building of extraordinary artistic quality, with walls decorated by some of the finest relief sculpture to survive from the Old Kingdom. The reliefs depict scenes of the king triumphing over foreign enemies, receiving tribute from subject peoples, hunting in the desert, and presiding over ceremonies at court. They are carved with a delicacy and a precision that suggest a royal workshop of the highest caliber, and they demonstrate that the Fifth Dynasty's reduction in pyramid size was accompanied by an increase in the artistic elaboration of temple complexes attached to those pyramids. The pyramid itself might have been smaller and less solidly built than its Fourth Dynasty predecessors, but the temple was more beautifully decorated than anything the Fourth Dynasty had produced. But the most transformative archaeological work at Abusir has been conducted not by German but by Czech archaeologists, and the story of their involvement is itself a remarkable chapter in the history of Egyptology. In 1960, the Czechoslovak Institute of Egyptology, based at Charles University in Prague, received permission from the Egyptian government to begin archaeological work at Abusir. The institute was led by Zabinek Zaba and later by Miroslav Werner, who would become the foremost authority on the Abusir necropolis and one of the most respected Egyptologists of his generation. Werner arrived at Abusir in the 1970s and devoted the next 4 decades of his career to the systematic excavation of the site, working season after season in conditions that ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the physically punishing. The desert heat at Abusir is relentless during the excavation season, and the site's remote location, accessible only by unpaved desert tracks, meant that the Czech team operated in relative isolation, far from the infrastructure and support systems available to excavators working at more prominent sites like Giza or Luxor. Werner later wrote that Abusir rewarded patience and punished haste, that the site yielded its secrets reluctantly, and only to those who were willing to spend years sifting through rubble and reading the barely legible traces of ancient activity in the bedrock beneath. His persistence paid dividends that transformed the field. Werner's work transformed Abusir from a minor archaeological footnote into one of the most important sources of evidence for Old Kingdom history and administration. Werner's most significant discovery was not a tomb or a statue or a piece of jewellery. It was paper, or rather papyrus. Beginning in the 1980s, and continuing through subsequent decades of excavation, Werner and his team recovered thousands of fragments of papyrus from the ruins of the temple complexes at Abusir. These fragments, painstakingly cleaned, conserved, and assembled, constitute the Abusir Papyri, the oldest known administrative archive from ancient Egypt and one of the most important documentary discoveries in the history of Egyptology. The papyri had been stored in the temple archives, probably in wooden chests or clay jars, and had survived because the dry desert conditions at the edge of the floodplain had preserved the organic material that would have rotted away in a more humid environment. Many of the fragments were tiny, no larger than a postage stamp, their surfaces covered with the cursive hieratic script that Egyptian administrators used for everyday record-keeping. The work of reading and interpreting these fragments has occupied specialists for decades and is still ongoing. What the Abusir Papyri reveal is a picture of Old Kingdom administration that is far more detailed and far more complex than anything that had been previously available. The papyri include duty rosters for the priests who served in the pyramid temples, listing the names of individual priests, the days they were assigned to serve, and the specific duties they were expected to perform. They include inventories of temple equipment, listing every item in the temple's possession, from ceremonial vessels and ritual implements to furniture, textiles, and tools. They include records of offerings, detailing the quantities of bread, beer, meat, grain, incense, and other commodities that were delivered to the temple on a daily, monthly, and annual basis. They include inspection reports documenting the regular examinations of the temple buildings and their contents that were carried out by royal officials to ensure that the cult was being properly maintained, and they include correspondence between the temple administration and the central government, providing a window into the communication networks that connected the individual pyramid complexes to the broader apparatus of the Egyptian state. The Czech Egyptologist Paul Posner-Krieger, who spent decades studying the Abusir Papyri before her death in 2007, described them as nothing less than a revelation. Before the discovery of the Abusir Papyri, our understanding of how the Egyptian pyramid cult actually functioned on a day-to-day basis was based almost entirely on inference, on extrapolation from the physical remains of the temples and from analogies with better documented later periods. The papyri provided direct evidence, administrative data generated by the system itself, that allowed scholars to reconstruct the daily operations of the pyramid cult with a precision that had never before been possible. The picture that emerged was one of extraordinary institutional complexity. The maintenance of a single pyramid temple required a permanent staff of priests, organized in rotating shifts, a supply chain that delivered fresh offerings on a daily basis from royal estates distributed across Egypt, a system of accounting that tracked every commodity received and disbursed, and a bureaucratic hierarchy that extended from the individual temple to the central administration of the king. The irony is devastating. The pyramids themselves, the physical monuments that the entire system existed to serve, were built with rubble cores that began to collapse the moment their protective casings were removed. But the administrative system that maintained the pyramid cult was one of the most sophisticated bureaucratic operations in the ancient world, a machine of institutional precision that continued to function for centuries after the pyramids were completed. The system outlasted the structures it was designed to protect. The paperworks survived when the stone did not, and the discovery of the Abusir Papyri revealed a truth about the Fifth Dynasty that the ruined pyramids alone could never have communicated, that the real achievement of the Fifth Dynasty was not architectural but administrative, not the buildings but the institutions, not the stone but the system. This is the paradox that sits at the heart of Abusir, and it is a paradox that speaks directly to the modern world. We tend to judge civilizations by their monuments. We measure greatness in stone. The Fourth Dynasty is great because it built the Great Pyramid. The Fifth Dynasty is lesser because it built smaller pyramids with rubble cores. But the Abusir Papyri suggests that this judgment is superficial, that the Fifth Dynasty's real achievement was not visible in stone but recorded on papyrus, not expressed in the height of its pyramids, but embedded in the complexity of its institutions. The Fifth Dynasty did not build smaller pyramids because it was weaker than the Fourth Dynasty. It built smaller pyramids because it had redirected its resources toward a different set of priorities, toward sun temples, toward temple decoration, toward the administrative infrastructure that sustained the pyramid cult, and toward a system of governance that would prove more durable and more influential than any single monument. And this is where the real mystery of Abusir begins, because the shift from monumental architecture to institutional complexity is not a sign of decline, it is a sign of maturation. It is what happens when a civilization moves beyond the phase of conspicuous display and into the phase of systematic management. And yet, the ruins at Abusir look like decline. They look like failure. They look like the remnants of a civilization that could no longer build what its predecessors had built. The gap between appearance and reality, between what the ruins suggest and what the documents reveal, is the gap that makes Abusir one of the most intellectually provocative sites in all of Egyptian archaeology. The pyramid complex of Sahure, the first and best preserved of the Abusir pyramids, provides the clearest window into what the Fifth Dynasty builders were trying to achieve. The complex followed the standard plan that had been established during the Fourth Dynasty, a valley temple at the edge of the cultivation, connected by a long covered causeway to the mortuary temple on the east face of the pyramid. But Sahure's architects elaborated this plan with a sophistication that exceeded anything the Fourth Dynasty had attempted. The valley temple was approached by two ramps, one leading from a canal and one leading from the land, and it was decorated with granite columns whose capitals were carved in the form of palm fronds, a motif that was both beautiful and symbolically loaded, evoking the verdant paradise that awaited the king in the afterlife. The causeway that connected the valley temple to the mortuary temple was approximately 235 meters long, roofed and enclosed, its inner walls decorated with painted reliefs that transformed the corridor into a narrative sequence, a visual journey that accompanied the visitor from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The mortuary temple itself was Sahure's masterpiece. Borchart's excavation revealed a building of considerable size and complexity, with an entrance hall, an open courtyard surrounded by a colonnade of palm columns, a series of storage magazines, a chapel containing a false door, through which the king's spirit could receive offerings, and a suite of ritual rooms whose specific functions are still debated. The walls were covered with an estimated 10,000 square meters of relief decoration, making it one of the most extensively decorated buildings in the Old Kingdom. The quality of the carving was exceptional. The scenes depicted the king in the traditional poses of Egyptian royal art, smiting enemies, receiving the blessings of the gods, hunting in the desert, sailing in boats, and presiding over the rituals that sustained the cosmic order. But they also included scenes that were new to Egyptian art, including depictions of foreign trade expeditions, with ships returning from the coast of Lebanon loaded with timber, and scenes of the king hunting with tame cheetahs, a detail that provides rare evidence for the domestication of wild animals in Old Kingdom Egypt. The German archaeologist and art historian Herbert Ricker, who studied the sun temples of the Fifth Dynasty in detail, described the artistic program of the Sahure complex as representing a new conception of the relationship between the king and the cosmos. Where the Fourth Dynasty kings had expressed their cosmic role through the overwhelming physical mass of their pyramids, the Fifth Dynasty kings expressed it through the narrative richness of their temple decoration. The shift was from mass to message, from the inarticulate enormity of stone to the articulate eloquence of carved relief. This is a critical insight for understanding why the Abusir pyramids look the way they do. The Fifth Dynasty builders were not trying and failing to build Fourth Dynasty pyramids. They were building something different, a monument in which the temple mattered more than the pyramid, in which the decoration mattered more than the mass, and in which the administrative system that maintained the cult mattered more than the physical structure that housed it. The Pyramid of Neferirkare, Sahure's successor and the second king to build at Abusir, provides additional evidence for this interpretation. Neferirkare's pyramid was originally planned as a step pyramid, a deliberate archaism that recalled the earliest form of pyramid construction, and that may have reflected a desire to associate the king with the most ancient traditions of Egyptian kingship. Partway through construction, the plan was changed, and the stepped core was encased in a smooth outer layer that would have given the finished monument the appearance of a true pyramid. But the conversion was never completed. Neferirkare died before the casing could be finished, and the pyramid stands today as a hybrid structure, its stepped core partially visible beneath the remnants of the unfinished outer casing. The mortuary temple attached to the pyramid was also left incomplete at the king's death, and was finished in a cruder style by his successors, using mudbrick rather than stone for the parts that remained unbuilt. The result is a monument that reveals its own construction history with unusual clarity, a building in which the plans, the changes, the compromises, and the improvisations of the builders are visible in the fabric of the structure itself. It was in the ruins of Neferirkare's mortuary temple that some of the most important fragments of the Abusir Papyri were discovered. The papyri had been stored in the temple's archive rooms and had survived the collapse of the building's mud brick walls because the dry desert conditions at the edge of the floodplain prevented organic papyrus fibers from rotting. The fragments were found scattered among the rubble of the collapsed temple, many of them broken, stained, and partially destroyed by insects and moisture. But enough survived to allow specialists to reconstruct substantial portions of the original document. The duty rosters recovered from Neferirkare's temple reveal that the temple staff operated on a rotating system of monthly shifts, with 5 groups of priests taking turns to serve the cult. Each group was responsible for maintaining the daily offerings, performing the rituals, cleaning the temple, guarding the sacred spaces, and reporting any damage or irregularity to the central administration. The level of detail in these records is extraordinary. Individual priests are named, their specific duties are listed, the quantities of offerings are recorded with precision. The system was not casual or improvised. It was a professional operation, staffed by trained personnel, funded by dedicated royal endowments, and monitored by regular inspections from the central bureaucracy. The economic resources required to sustain this system were substantial. The royal estates that funded the pyramid temples were scattered across Egypt, from the Delta in the north to Upper Egypt in the south, and the logistical challenge of collecting, transporting, and distributing the products of these estates to the individual temple complexes was itself a major administrative undertaking. The pyramid cult was not a simple act of worship. It was an economic institution, a redistribution network that channeled agricultural surplus from the royal estates to the temples, and from the temples to the priests and workers who maintained them. The implications of this system are profound. The pyramid was not merely a tomb. It was the anchor of an entire economic and social network, a node in a web of relationships that connected the king, the priesthood, the royal estates, and the central administration in a system of mutual obligation and institutional interdependence. When a pyramid was built, it was not merely a monument that was created. It was an institution that was founded, an institution that would require ongoing investment, ongoing management, and ongoing administrative attention for as long as the cult was maintained. The Abusir Papyri show that this institutional dimension of pyramid construction was at least as important as the architectural dimension, and possibly more so. The pyramid was the visible tip of an administrative iceberg, and the mass beneath the surface, the system of estates, supply chains, duty rosters, inspections, and correspondence that sustained the cult, was far larger and far more complex than the monument itself. And it is this institutional dimension that makes the ruins of Abusir so much more important than their modest appearance would suggest. The pyramids may be rubble, the temples may be in ruins, the causeways may be reduced to foundation cuttings in the bedrock, but the documents that were produced by the system that maintained these monuments have survived, and they tell a story that the stones alone could never have communicated. They tell the story of a civilization that was not declining but evolving, not weakening but redirecting its energies from the visible to the invisible, from the monumental to the institutional, from the massive pyramid to the meticulous papyrus. The core problem of Abusir is a problem of interpretation, and it begins with the rubble. Stand at the base of Sahure's pyramid today and look up at the exposed core, and what you see is a mass of rough-cut stone, sand, and construction debris that looks nothing like the precisely engineered fabric of the Great Pyramid. The blocks are irregular, the joints are wide, the filling material is loose. In places, you can push a hand into the gaps between the stones and feel nothing but sand and gravel. This is not the work of incompetent builders. The casing stones that once covered this core were cut and fitted with the same precision that characterized the finest Fourth Dynasty masonry. The mortuary temple that stood beside the pyramid was decorated with relief carvings of exceptional quality. The causeway that connected the temple to the valley below was a carefully engineered structure with drainage channels and pavement of polished limestone. Everything around the pyramid was executed to the highest standard. The pyramid itself, the centerpiece of the entire complex, the monument that was supposed to endure for eternity, was filled with rubble. The question is why? And the answer, as with most questions about the deep past, is more complicated than it first appears. The simplest explanation is economic. Solid stone construction is vastly more expensive than rubble fill construction. The Great Pyramid of Khufu required the quarrying, transportation, and precise placement of an estimated 2.3 million blocks, each of which had to be cut to specific dimensions and fitted into a predetermined position in the pyramid's fabric. Rubble fill requires none of this precision. Rough-cut blocks can be any size or shape. Sand and gravel can be shoveled into place by unskilled labourers. The savings in time, labour, and material are enormous. A pyramid built with a rubble core can be raised in a fraction of the time required for a solid stone pyramid, and at a fraction of the cost. For a king whose reign might last only a decade or two, and who needed to complete both a pyramid and a sun temple within that time, the economic logic of rubble fill was compelling. But the economic explanation, while true as far as it goes, does not fully account for the shift. The resources of the Egyptian state did not suddenly decline between the 4th and 5th dynasties. The Nile still flooded, the harvests were still abundant, the population was still large enough to supply the workforce needed for monumental construction. The quarries at Tura and Aswan were still productive. The administrative apparatus that had organized the construction of the Great Pyramid was still in place. What changed was not the capacity to build, but the priorities of building. The 5th dynasty kings chose to distribute their resources differently, spreading them across a wider range of projects rather than concentrating them on a single overwhelming monument. The sun temples, the elaborately decorated mortuary temples, the royal estates that funded the pyramid cult, the expanded priesthood that maintained the daily rituals, all of these demanded resources that the 4th dynasty had poured into stone. The pyramid shrank because the institutional periphery around it grew, consuming an ever larger share of the finite resources that the Egyptian state could mobilize for construction and cult maintenance in any given reign. The American archaeologist Anne Macy Roth has argued that this redistribution of resources was not merely an economic decision, but a political one. The 4th dynasty kings had concentrated power so completely in the person of the pharaoh that the Great Pyramid can be read as a monument to absolute centralization, a structure that required the coordinated effort of the entire state, and that symbolized the pharaoh's capacity to command that effort. The 5th dynasty kings, by contrast, distributed power more broadly. They created endowed positions for the priesthood. They granted estates to loyal officials. They expanded the bureaucracy. They created institutional structures that gave more people a stake in the system, and that made the system less dependent on the personal authority of any single king. The rubble-fill pyramid is, in this reading, a symbol not of weakness, but of delegation. The king no longer needed to demonstrate his absolute power through a mountain of solid stone. He demonstrated it through the complexity of the institutions that served him, and through the number of people who depended on his patronage. This political interpretation is supported by the archaeological evidence from the tomb of Ptahshepses, one of the most important non-royal tombs at Abusir. Ptahshepses was a high official of the 5th dynasty who served under multiple kings and who married a royal princess, a mark of extraordinary favour that placed him at the apex of the Egyptian elite. His tomb, excavated by the Czech expedition, is one of the largest and most elaborately decorated non-royal tombs of the Old Kingdom, with a plan that includes features previously reserved exclusively for royal monuments, including a portico with columns, a large courtyard, and walls decorated with scenes of daily life that are among the finest examples of Old Kingdom painting. The sheer size and quality of Ptahshepses' tomb tells us something important about the distribution of resources in the 5th dynasty. The wealth that the 4th dynasty had concentrated almost exclusively on the royal pyramid was now being shared with a wider circle of elite officials, who used their newfound resources to build tombs of unprecedented scale and elaboration. The pyramid got smaller, the elite tombs got larger, the balance of monumental display shifted from the exclusive to the distributive, and it gets worse, or rather, it gets more complicated. The pyramid of Neferirkare, the 4th king to build at Abusir, was never completed at all. Neferirkare, who is also known in the scholarly literature as Rainforef, came to the throne around 2419 BC and reigned for only a few years before dying young. His pyramid was barely begun when he died. Only the first few courses of the core had been laid. forming a low, roughly square platform of rubble and stone that rose no more than 7 meters above the desert surface. The pyramid was never cased. The mortuary temple was never built in stone. Instead, Neferefre's successors completed the mortuary temple in mudbrick, creating a functional but architecturally modest structure that could sustain the king's funeral cult without the expense of stone construction. The Czech excavation of Neferefre's complex, conducted by Miroslav Werner in the 1980s and 90s, produced some of the most remarkable discoveries in the history of Abusir archaeology. Werner found that the unfinished pyramid had been converted into a mastaba-like structure, its truncated core covered with a layer of rubble and capped with a rough surface of desert gravel that gave it the appearance of a low, flat-topped mound rather than a pyramid. The mortuary temple, built in mudbrick but laid out according to the canonical temple plan, contained a rich collection of artifacts including fragments of royal statuary, ritual vessels and, crucially, additional fragments of the Abusir Papyri that supplemented the documents already known from Neferirkare's temple. But the most extraordinary discovery was the royal mummy itself, or rather what remained of it. In the burial chamber, which had been cut into the bedrock beneath the truncated pyramid, Werner found the fragmentary remains of a mummified body that he identified as Neferefre's. The mummy had been badly damaged by ancient tomb robbers, but enough survived to allow physical, anthropological analysis. The examination revealed that Neferefre had been a young man at the time of his death, probably in his early 20s, confirming the historical inference that his reign had been cut short by premature death. The discovery of Neferefre's mummy in an unfinished pyramid raises questions that go to the heart of Egyptian funerary beliefs, and to the broader question of what the pyramid actually meant to the people who built them. The pyramid was incomplete. The mortuary temple was a makeshift construction of mudbrick that would have seemed crude and inadequate by the standards of any previous dynasty. The entire complex was, by the architectural standards of the Fifth Dynasty itself, a failure, a project that had been started with royal ambition and full knowledge of the canonical requirements, and completed with administrative pragmatism, born of the hard reality that the king had died before his monument was ready. And yet the king was buried there, his body mummified, his cult established, his offerings maintained. The unfinished pyramid did not prevent the burial from taking place. The mudbrick temple did not prevent the cult from functioning. The institutional system was flexible enough to adapt to the unexpected death of the king, and to provide for his afterlife, even when the physical monument was far from what had been planned. The system worked. The building did not. And the fact that the system worked, despite the failure of the building, tells us something crucial about the priorities of the Fifth Dynasty state. The institution mattered more than the monument. The cult mattered more than the pyramid. The papyrus mattered more than the stone. But here is the problem. The flexibility that allowed the system to adapt to Neferefre's premature death was also the flexibility that allowed the system to tolerate increasingly compromised construction standards. If a mudbrick temple could sustain the cult just as effectively as a stone temple, why build in stone? If a rubble core could support a core casing just as well as a solid core, why build in solid stone? If an unfinished pyramid could receive a royal burial and maintain a functioning cult, why finish the pyramid at all? The logic of institutional efficiency, once set in motion, tends to erode the standards of physical construction that it was originally designed to support. Each compromise demonstrates that the previous standard was not, in fact, necessary. Each adaptation proves that the system can function with less, and each reduction in physical standards makes the next reduction easier to justify. The Pyramid of Djoser, the fifth king to build at Abusir, demonstrates exactly this trajectory of diminishing physical standards masked by institutional sophistication. Djoser was one of the more powerful kings of the Fifth Dynasty, reigning for approximately 30 years, a length of time that should have been more than sufficient to build a pyramid of considerable size and quality. And indeed, Djoser's pyramid is one of the larger monuments at Abusir, with a base length of roughly 78 meters and an original height of approximately 52 meters. but the construction technique was the same rubble fill method that had been used by his predecessors, and the core has deteriorated just as severely as theirs. The casing stones are gone. The rubble core has collapsed into an amorphous mound. The geometric form that the pyramid once possessed is entirely lost. What distinguishes Djoser's complex from those of his predecessors is not the pyramid, but the temple. Djoser's mortuary temple, excavated by Burckhardt in the early 20th century, was a building of considerable architectural ambition and spatial complexity, with a complex plan that incorporated features borrowed from both pyramid temples and sun temples. The temple included a massive entrance portico, a colonnaded courtyard, a transverse corridor, a series of storage magazines, and an inner sanctuary with a false door and offering chapel. The walls were decorated with reliefs that, while not as well preserved as those in Sahure's temple, indicate a similar commitment to artistic quality and narrative complexity. Djoser also built a sun temple at Abu Ghurab, the best preserved of all the Fifth Dynasty sun temples, which has been extensively studied by both German and Italian archaeological teams. The sun temple included a massive obelisk-shaped monument, an open courtyard with an alabaster altar carved with representations of the sun god, and a series of reliefs depicting the seasons of the agricultural year that are among the most important documents of Old Kingdom art and religion. The concentration of Djoser's resources on temple construction rather than pyramid construction is consistent with the pattern observed across the entire Fifth Dynasty. Each successive king invested more in the institutional and artistic dimensions of the royal funerary complex, and less in the physical mass and structural integrity of the pyramid itself. The pyramid was still built, the form was still maintained, the theological requirements were still met, but the substance, the actual quality of the construction, was steadily declining, concealed behind casings that maintained the appearance of permanence, while the interior became progressively more compromised. And it gets worse. The pyramids of the late Fifth Dynasty and the subsequent Sixth Dynasty continued this trajectory of diminishing construction quality until the pyramids of kings like Teti, Pepi I, Merenre, and Pepi II, all built at Saqqara, were monuments of such poor structural quality that they have collapsed almost entirely, surviving as low mounds of rubble that are barely distinguishable from the surrounding desert. These later pyramids did, however, introduce something that the Abusir pyramids lacked: the pyramid texts, the vast corpus of religious spells and incantations carved into the walls of the burial chambers that constitute the oldest large body of religious literature in the world. The pyramid texts represent yet another dimension of the shift from physical to textual, from the monumental to the inscriptional, that began at Abusir. The pyramid's exterior was becoming less impressive. Its interior was becoming more articulate. The stone was speaking, even as the structure that contained it was losing the ability to stand. But here is what makes this truly terrifying, not for the ancient Egyptians but for us, for anyone living in a complex civilization that is experiencing its own version of the shift from substance to system. The pattern visible at Abusir, the pattern of declining physical quality, masked by increasing institutional complexity, is not unique to ancient Egypt. It is a pattern that has been observed in civilizations across the world, across thousands of years, and it is a pattern that the modern world is repeating with eerie precision. The anthropologist Joseph Tainter, whose work on the collapse of complex societies has become one of the foundational texts in the study of civilizational decline, has argued that complex societies collapse not because they are conquered or because they suffer catastrophic environmental disasters, but because they experience diminishing marginal returns on investment in complexity. Each additional layer of institutional complexity produces less benefit than the previous layer, while costing at least as much to maintain. The bureaucracy grows. The administrative overhead increases. The proportion of a society's resources consumed by the management of the system rather than the production of useful output rises steadily, and at a certain point, the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefits that the system provides, and the society begins to simplify, to shed the institutional layers that have become too expensive to sustain. The Abusir evidence fits Tainter's model with disturbing precision. The Fifth Dynasty state was more institutionally complex than the Fourth Dynasty state. It had more priests organized in more elaborate rotation systems. It had more administrators managing more extensive record-keeping operations. It had more estates producing more agricultural surplus to feed more temple staff, maintaining more pyramid cults across a wider geographical area. The Abusir Papyri document an administrative apparatus of remarkable sophistication, a system of interlocking institutions that required constant management, constant funding, and constant attention to function properly. But that apparatus consumed resources that the Fourth Dynasty had devoted to pyramid construction. The institutional periphery grew relentlessly. The monumental core shrank correspondingly. The system became more elaborate, more expensive, and more genuinely sophisticated in its organizational design, while the visible output of the system, the pyramids that the entire apparatus existed to serve, became less impressive, less durable, less structurally sound, and less capable of surviving the passage of time without their protective casing stones. The rubble-filled pyramid is not a sign of poverty. It is a sign of institutional overextension, a physical manifestation of a society that is spending so much on the management of complexity that it can no longer afford the products that the complexity was originally designed to produce. Something is wrong with our assumptions about what constitutes civilizational achievement. We measure achievement in monuments. We judge civilizations by the size of their pyramids, the height of their cathedrals, the span of their bridges, the reach of their rockets. But the Abusir evidence suggests that the most significant achievements of a mature civilization may be invisible, encoded not in stone but in systems, not in monuments but in institutions, not in the things a civilization builds, but in the way it organizes the building. The Fifth Dynasty built smaller pyramids than the Fourth Dynasty, but it created administrative systems of a complexity and a sophistication that the Fourth Dynasty never approached. It produced documents that have survived for more than 4,000 years, and that tell us more about how the Egyptian state actually functioned than all the pyramids of Giza combined. It founded institutions that outlasted the monuments they were designed to serve. The question is whether this trade-off, monuments for institutions, stone for papyrus, visible achievement for invisible sophistication, represents genuine progress or something more ambiguous, something that future historians will recognize as the first stage of a long and ultimately irreversible decline. And the ruins of Abusir, crumbling and forlorn in the desert sun, battered by wind and stripped of every surface that once concealed their compromised interiors, refuse to give a simple answer. The silence that surrounds the Abusir pyramids today is not the silence of a place that was never important. It is the silence of a place that was important in ways that are not immediately visible, that made its most significant contributions not in the language of stone, but in the language of administration, and that has been overlooked and undervalued precisely because its achievements do not photograph well. The pyramids of Giza are iconic. The pyramids of Abusir are not. But the papyri of Abusir have told us more about the inner workings of the Egyptian state than anything found at Giza. The ruins are unphotogenic, the documents are revolutionary, and the gap between the two, between the visual modesty of the site and the intellectual richness of what it has produced, is the gap that defines Abusir's place in the history of Egyptian archaeology and in the larger history of human civilization. The sun temples that the Fifth Dynasty kings built alongside their pyramids deserve closer examination because they embody the theological revolution that drove the architectural changes visible at Abusir. At least 6 sun temples were built during the Fifth Dynasty, though only 2 have been located and excavated. The Sun Temple of Userkaf and the Sun Temple of Neferirkare, both at Abu Ghurab. The other 4, attributed to Sahure, Neferirkare, Neferefre, and Menkaure, have never been found, though textual references confirm their existence. The Sun Temples that have been excavated reveal a building type that has no precedent in earlier Egyptian architecture. They are open-air sanctuaries, oriented to the sun, centered on a massive squat obelisk that stood on a podium at the western end of a large courtyard. The obelisk symbolized the Benben stone, the primordial mound of creation on which the sun god first manifested, and its form was designed to catch and reflect the rays of the sun throughout the day. The courtyard contained an alabaster altar where offerings were made directly to the sun, and the walls were decorated with scenes depicting the natural world, the seasons, the flora and fauna of Egypt, rendered with an observational precision that suggests a deep engagement with the physical world as a manifestation of divine order. The sun temples were not mortuary monuments. They were not associated with burials. They were not designed to protect the dead or to facilitate the king's ascent to the sky. They were temples of worship, places where the living king demonstrated his piety to the sun god and his role as the intermediary between the divine and the human worlds. The construction of a sun temple, in addition to a pyramid, represented a doubling of the king's monumental obligations, and the economic impact of this doubling is visible in the reduced scale and quality of the pyramids themselves. The Sun Temple of Djoser, the best preserved of the two excavated examples, covers an area of roughly 100 by 80 meters and includes a valley temple, a covered causeway, and the upper temple with its obelisk and courtyard. Building this complex required significant quantities of limestone, granite, and alabaster, materials that might otherwise have been devoted to making the pyramid's core more substantial. The relationship between the Sun Temple and the pyramid is not merely economic, it is theological. The Fourth Dynasty kings had identified themselves primarily with Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, who was the divine prototype of Egyptian kingship. The pyramid was the mechanism through which the dead king became one with Horus and ascended to the sky. The Fifth Dynasty kings, while not abandoning the Horus identification, added a new and equally important divine association. They identified themselves as the sons of Ra, the sun god, a claim that the Westcar papyrus preserves in mythological form. The Sun Temple was the architectural expression of this new claim, a monument that declared the king's solar parentage and that maintained the cult of the father god during the king's lifetime. The pyramid remained the mechanism of the king's posthumous transformation, but the Sun Temple introduced a parallel mechanism, a living cult that operated alongside the funerary cult and that competed with it for the resources of the royal building program. The competition between these two systems, the funerary and the solar, shaped the entire trajectory of Fifth Dynasty monumental architecture. The pyramid tradition did not simply decline, it was displaced, edged out by a competing tradition that drew on the same pool of resources and that offered the king an alternative means of demonstrating his cosmic significance. The rubble-filled pyramid was not a failure of ambition or a symptom of poverty. It was the consequence of a theological bifurcation, a division of monumental purpose that stretched the available resources across two projects instead of one, and that forced the builders to economize on the project that was less visually prominent and less theologically innovative. The pyramid was the old tradition, the Sun Temple was the new one, and when old traditions compete with new ones for limited resources, the old traditions almost always lose. This dynamic, the displacement of an established monumental tradition by a competing innovation, is not unique to ancient Egypt. It has occurred repeatedly throughout the history of human civilization, and it always follows the same pattern. The old tradition is maintained in form, but hollowed out in substance. The external appearance of continuity is preserved while the internal reality is compromised. The casing remains intact while the core fills with rubble, and by the time the casing is removed, by the time the compromise is exposed, the tradition has already been displaced by its successor and cannot be restored. The Roman Republic provides a parallel that is almost uncannily precise. The institutions of the Republic, the Senate, the assemblies, the magistracies, the legal procedures that had governed Rome for centuries, were maintained in form throughout the transition to the empire. Augustus did not abolish the Senate. He did not dissolve the assemblies. He did not declare himself king. He maintained every outward form of the Republican constitution, while hollowing out its substance, concentrating real power in his own hands, while preserving the institutional facades that made the transition psychologically acceptable to the Roman elite. The Republic's institutional casing remained intact. Its core had been replaced with something fundamentally different, and by the time the casing was removed, by the time later emperors dispensed with the republican pretenses that Augustus had maintained, the republic was already dead, its substance long since replaced by the rubble of imperial autocracy. The parallel with Abusir is not exact, but it is revealing and deeply instructive for anyone trying to understand the dynamics of institutional change in complex societies. In both cases, an established system is maintained in its outward form, while its internal substance is progressively replaced by something less costly, less substantial, and more flexible. In both cases, the replacement is driven not by malice or incompetence or any conscious desire to degrade the system, but by the rational response of practical decision-makers to change circumstances and competing demands on limited resources. In both cases, the compromise is concealed by the meticulous preservation of external appearances, by the maintenance of forms and rituals and procedures that create the impression of continuity even as the substance beneath them is being hollowed out, and in both cases, the exposure of the compromise, when it finally comes, reveals a gap between appearance and reality that is far wider and far more consequential than anyone had suspected, while the facade remained intact. But here is the problem. We cannot always tell when we are living inside a rubble-filled pyramid. The casing is intact, the exterior looks solid, the system functions, the institutions operate, the paperwork flows, the rituals are performed. Everything looks the way it has always looked. And inside, behind the polished surface, the core is rubble, held in place by nothing more than the casing itself. And the moment the casing cracks, the moment the external facade is breached, the entire structure will reveal its emptiness and begin to collapse. The Fifth Dynasty Egyptians could not see the rubble inside their pyramids. The casing was smooth and white and perfect. The rubble was hidden, and the civilization that produced the rubble did not understand that it was producing rubble, because the rubble looked, from the outside, exactly like solid stone. The Abusir Papyri offer one more critical insight that bears directly on this question of hidden compromise. The administrative records document a system that was functioning with impressive efficiency. The priests arrived on time. The offerings were delivered on schedule. The inspections were conducted regularly. The accounts balanced. From the perspective of the papyri, the pyramid cult was a well-managed, professionally staffed, fiscally responsible institution that was operating exactly as designed. But the papyri tell us nothing about the quality of the pyramid itself. They record the operations of the temple, not the condition of the monument. The administrative system was excellent. The physical structure it served was filled with rubble, and the administrators who produced the papyri had no reason to record that fact, because the rubble was hidden behind casing stones, and the administrative system did not measure the quality of the core. It measured the quality of the system. This is a pattern that any modern observer should recognize immediately. Our own institutions produce enormous quantities of performance data, metrics, benchmarks, key performance indicators, quarterly reports, annual assessments, all designed to measure the efficiency of the system. But these measurements often capture the operation of the institutional machinery rather than the quality of the underlying output. A hospital can score well on administrative metrics while the quality of patient care deteriorates. A university can produce impressive research output statistics while the quality of undergraduate teaching declines. A corporation can report excellent financial results while the quality of its products erodes. The metrics measure the system. The system is excellent. The output, hidden behind the polished facade of institutional performance data, is rubble. The Fifth Dynasty Egyptians invented bureaucracy, or rather, they brought bureaucracy to a level of sophistication that had never previously existed in the ancient world. The Abusir Papyri are the earliest evidence of this achievement, and they are, in their own way, as impressive as the Great Pyramid. They represent a new kind of monumental construction, a construction not of stone but of information, not of blocks but of records, not of physical space but of institutional order. But the civilization that invented sophisticated bureaucracy also invented the rubble-filled pyramid, and the connection between the two is not coincidental. The bureaucracy grew because the pyramid shrank. The institutions expanded because the monuments contracted. The system became more elaborate because the product became less substantial. And the question that Abusir poses, the question that its ruined pyramids and its pristine papyri ask, with the quiet insistence of evidence that refuses to be ignored, is whether this trade-off is progress or decline, evolution or erosion, maturation or decay. The ruins offer no definitive answer. They offer only the image, haunting and unforgettable once you have seen it, of pyramids that looked solid from the outside and were hollow within. Pyramids that maintained the form of their predecessors, while abandoning the substance. Pyramids that were built by a civilization that had mastered the art of institutional management, and that applied that mastery not to producing better monuments, but to maintaining worse ones. The casing stones are gone now. The rubble is exposed. The compromise that was invisible for centuries is visible to anyone who makes the journey to Abusir and looks at what the desert has uncovered. And the lesson of that exposure, the lesson of rubble revealed, is one that applies to any civilization that has ever confused the efficiency of its systems with the quality of its outputs, that has ever mistaken institutional sophistication for substantive achievement, that has ever looked at a polished surface and assumed that what lay beneath it was solid. The wind blows across the Abusir plateau, the rubble settles, and the papyri, stored in museums in Prague and Cairo, continue to tell the story of a system that worked perfectly, that functioned with admirable precision, and that served pyramids that were already, from the day they were completed, beginning to fall apart. The story of Abusir gains its deepest resonance when each pyramid complex is examined not as an isolated monument, but as a chapter in a longer narrative of adaptation, compromise, and institutional evolution. Because the pyramids of Abusir are not identical. Each one represents a different king's response to the same set of constraints, a different attempt to reconcile the theological imperatives of pyramid construction with the economic realities of a state whose resources were being spread across an ever-expanding range of institutional commitments. Taken together, they form a sequence, a visible trajectory of change that spans roughly a century of Egyptian history and that documents, in stone and rubble and papyrus, one of the most consequential transitions in the history of human civilization. The first chapter belongs to Sahure. When Sahure came to the throne around 2487 BC, he was the first king to choose Abusir as the site for his pyramid complex, and his monument set the pattern that every subsequent builder at the site would follow. The pyramid itself, with its base of approximately 78 meters and its original height of roughly 47 meters, was a competent but unremarkable structure by the standards of its time. Its rubble-filled core, concealed behind a casing of Tura limestone, would not have attracted comment from contemporaries who could not see what lay behind the polished white surface. But the temple complex attached to the pyramid was anything but unremarkable. The mortuary temple of Sahure was one of the most ambitiously decorated buildings of the entire Old Kingdom. Its walls covered with an estimated 10,000 square meters of painted relief, a figure that represents more carved surface area than any other known temple from the period. The content of these reliefs is as significant as their quantity. Sahure's artists depicted scenes that had no precedent in earlier Egyptian royal art. One series of reliefs shows the king presiding over the return of a maritime expedition from the coast of Lebanon, with ships loaded with cedar timber, the precious building material that Egypt lacked, and that had to be imported across the Mediterranean at enormous expense. The ships are depicted with remarkable nautical accuracy, their rigging, their hull construction, their cargo arrangements, all rendered with the observational detail of artists who had seen real ships and who understood how they worked. Another series shows the king hunting with tame cheetahs, animals that had been captured in the wild and trained for the royal hunt, a practice that provides rare evidence for the ancient Egyptian relationship with wild animals, and that suggests a level of ecological knowledge and animal management that is not attested in the more formal artistic programs of earlier dynasties. Still another series depicts foreign peoples, Libyans and Asiatics, bringing tribute to the Egyptian court, their distinctive clothing, hairstyles, and physical features rendered with an ethnographic precision that has made these reliefs invaluable to scholars studying the cultural contacts of the Old Kingdom. The German Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt, who excavated Sahure's temple between 1902 and 1908, was overwhelmed by the quantity and quality of the relief decoration. His published report, which remains the primary reference for the complex, includes hundreds of plates documenting the carved and painted surfaces that his team uncovered. Borchardt recognized that the Sahure reliefs represented a new direction in Egyptian royal art, a move away from the monumental simplicity of Fourth Dynasty decoration toward a more narrative, more detailed, and more emotionally expressive style that would characterize the art of the late Old Kingdom and beyond. The king was no longer depicted solely in the frozen hieratic poses of eternal power. He was shown in action, hunting, sailing, receiving visitors, engaging with the world in ways that made him seem, for the first time in Egyptian art, almost human. The relief program of Sahure's temple raises a question that goes to the heart of the Abusir problem. The resources that were devoted to carving, painting, and polishing 10,000 square meters of relief decoration were resources that might have been used to build a more substantial pyramid core. The artistic investment was enormous. The stone cutting alone would have required hundreds of skilled craftsmen working for years. The painting, which covered every carved surface with vivid color, required specialized pigments imported from across Egypt and beyond. The organizational effort needed to coordinate this artistic program, to design the scenes, to lay out the compositions on the temple walls, to supervise the carving and painting by teams of artists working simultaneously on different sections, was itself a major administrative achievement. If even a fraction of these resources had been redirected to the pyramid core, the core would have been substantially more solid. But the resources were not redirected. They were spent on decoration, on narrative, on the visual elaboration of the king's relationship with the gods, the natural world, and the foreign peoples who surrounded Egypt. The Fifth Dynasty chose beauty over mass. It chose storytelling over stone. And the ruins at Abusir are the permanent record of that choice. The second chapter at Abusir belongs to Neferirkare, and it is in many ways the most important chapter of all because it was in the ruins of Neferirkare's temple that the largest and most significant portion of the Abusir Papyri was discovered. Neferirkare came to the throne around 2475 BC and reigned for approximately 10 years. His pyramid, originally planned as a step pyramid before being converted to a true pyramid during construction, was the tallest at Abusir, with an original height of roughly 72 meters and a base length of approximately 105 meters. The scale was ambitious, more ambitious than Sahure's, and the stepped core that is still partially visible beneath the remnants of the smooth outer casing suggests that Neferirkare's architects initially intended a more archaic and perhaps more conservative monument before changing the design to conform to the smooth-sided standard that had been established by the Fourth Dynasty. But Neferirkare died before his complex could be completed. The pyramid itself was finished, or very nearly finished, but the mortuary temple was left in an incomplete state. The inner portions of the temple, the sanctuary and the offering hall, were built in stone, but the outer portions, the entrance hall, the colonnade, and the storage magazines, were completed in mudbrick by Neferirkare's successor, Djoser, who annexed portions of Neferirkare's causeway and valley temple for his own use. The result is a mortuary temple that is a hybrid of stone and mudbrick, a building that began as a monument of royal ambition and was completed as an exercise in administrative pragmatism. The stone portions are elegantly carved and precisely fitted. The mudbrick portions are functional but architecturally undistinguished. The contrast between the two is visible in the ruins and speaks directly to the conditions under which the temple was completed. Conditions of haste, limited resources, and political transition. It was in the mudbrick storage magazines of this hybrid temple that the Czech expedition found the papyri. The documents had been stored in the magazine rooms, probably in wooden chests or ceramic jars, and had survived the collapse of the mudbrick walls because the desert climate at the edge of the cultivation preserved the organic papyrus fibers that would have rotted away in a more humid environment. The fragments were found scattered among the rubble, many of them broken into pieces no larger than a few centimeters, their surfaces covered with the cursive hieratic script that Egyptian scribes used for administrative purposes. The work of recovering, cleaning, conserving and assembling these fragments has been one of the great achievements of modern Egyptological scholarship, a painstaking enterprise that has occupied specialists for decades, and that is still not complete. The Czech Egyptologist Paul Posner-Krieger, who devoted much of her career to the study of the Abusir Papyri, described the process of reassembling the fragments as similar to putting together a jigsaw puzzle, with most of the pieces missing and no picture on the box to guide you. Each fragment had to be examined under magnification, its script read and translated, its physical characteristics, the color of the papyrus, the thickness of the fibers, the spacing of the text, compared with those of other fragments to determine whether they belonged to the same document. The work required not only linguistic skill, but also a deep familiarity with the administrative practices of the Old Kingdom, the technical vocabulary of temple management, the conventions of hieratic handwriting, and the physical properties of ancient papyrus. Posner-Krieger brought all of these skills to the task, and her published editions of the Abusir Papyri remain the definitive scholarly treatment of these documents. What the papyri revealed was a system of extraordinary institutional precision. The temple of Neferirkare operated on a rotating schedule of priestly service, with groups of priests called files, a term borrowed from the Greek, each serving for 1 month at a time before being relieved by the next group. The file system ensured that the temple was never left unattended, that the daily offerings were always presented, and that the rituals of the mortuary cult were performed without interruption. Each file had a designated leader who was responsible for the conduct of his group during its month of service, and who was required to submit a written report at the end of each shift documenting the activities performed, the offerings presented, the equipment used, and any problems encountered. These reports were reviewed by a supervising official and filed in the temple archive, where they accumulated over months and years into a comprehensive record of the temple's operations. The third chapter belongs to Neferirkare, and it is the most poignant of all the Abusir stories. Neferirkare, also known in the scholarly literature as Rainforef, came to the throne young and died young, after a reign that may have lasted no more than 2 or 3 years. His pyramid at Abusir was barely begun when he died, rising only a few courses above the desert surface, a truncated mass of rubble and rough-cut stone that never received its casing and that was never converted into a recognizable pyramidal form. Instead, Neferirkare's successors capped the unfinished structure with a layer of gravel and mudbrick, creating a low, flat-topped mound that served as the king's burial place despite being, by any architectural standard, a failure. The mortuary temple was built entirely in mudbrick, without any stone elements, a construction technique that was fast and cheap, but that produced a building with a lifespan measured in decades rather than centuries. Miroslav Verner's excavation of Neferirkare's complex in the 1980s and 90s was one of the most technically demanding and most intellectually rewarding archaeological projects in the history of Abusir research. The mudbrick temple had collapsed almost entirely, its walls dissolved by the occasional desert rains that sweep across the Saqqara Abusir plateau, its rooms filled with windblown sand and the debris of centuries of erosion. Excavating this collapsed structure required extraordinary patience and precision, because the mudbrick walls, when dissolved, became almost indistinguishable from the surrounding sand and gravel, and the boundaries between wall and fill had to be identified through subtle differences in color, texture, and compaction that were visible only to experienced excavators working under controlled conditions. Werner later wrote that excavating mudbrick architecture in the Egyptian desert is one of the most demanding tasks in field archaeology, requiring the excavator to read the soil like a text, interpreting every variation in color and consistency as a potential clue to the location of a vanished wall or floor. What Werner found inside this unpromising ruin was astonishing. The temple contained a collection of royal statuary, that is among the finest to survive from the Old Kingdom. 6 limestone statues of Neferirkare were discovered, several of them in remarkably good condition, depicting the king in various poses, seated on a throne, standing with the symbols of royal authority, and in one extraordinary example, seated with a Horus falcon perched behind his head, its wings wrapped protectively around the king's crown. This statue, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is considered one of the masterpieces of Old Kingdom sculpture, a work of such technical accomplishment and such emotional power that it seems almost impossible to believe it was found in the ruins of a mudbrick temple attached to an unfinished pyramid. The contrast between the quality of the statue and the quality of the architecture that housed it is itself a statement about the priorities of the Fifth Dynasty. The art was magnificent, the building was makeshift, the institution was professional, the monument was an improvisation. The 4th chapter belongs to Djoser, and it is a chapter defined by appropriation. Neferirkare came to the throne around 2445 BC and reigned for approximately 30 years, one of the longer reigns of the Fifth Dynasty. He built his pyramid at Abusir as his predecessors had done, with a base of roughly 78 meters and an original height of approximately 52 meters. The rubble-fill core and the Tura limestone casing followed the pattern established by Sahure. But Djoser did something that none of his predecessors at Abusir had done. He appropriated portions of other kings' complexes for his own use. Specifically, he took over the unfinished causeway and valley temple of Neferirkare, completing them in his own name and connecting them to his own mortuary temple. This act of architectural appropriation has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence of Djoser's political power and self-confidence, his willingness to redirect resources from the cult of a predecessor to the enhancement of his own monument. Others have interpreted it as evidence of resource constraints, a sign that Djoser could not afford to build an entirely new causeway and valley temple from scratch, and was forced to repurpose existing infrastructure to complete his complex within the available budget. The truth probably lies somewhere between these interpretations. Djoser was a powerful king who left monuments throughout Egypt, including the best preserved of all the Fifth Dynasty sun temples at Abu Gharaib. He was not a ruler operating from a position of weakness, but his decision to appropriate Neferirkare's unfinished infrastructure suggests that even a powerful king with a long reign found it necessary to economize on certain aspects of his building program in order to concentrate resources on others. The Sun Temple at Abu Gharaib, with its massive obelisk, its alabaster altar, and its extensive relief program, was clearly a higher priority for Djoser than the causeway that connected his mortuary temple to the valley floor, and the fact that a king was willing to repurpose a predecessor's monument rather than build his own suggests that the resources available for monumental construction, while still substantial, were not unlimited. The margin was tightening. The institutional demands of the royal building program, the sun temples, the temple decorations, the priestly endowments, the administrative apparatus documented in the Abusir Papyri were consuming an ever larger share of the state's productive capacity, and the physical monuments were absorbing the cost of that consumption. The pattern visible at Abusir, the pattern of increasing institutional complexity accompanied by decreasing monumental quality, has parallels in other civilizations that are too precise to be coincidental. The Roman Empire of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD provides one of the most striking examples. During this period, the Roman bureaucratic apparatus expanded dramatically, with new layers of administration, new provincial structures, new tax collection systems, and new military commands being created to manage an empire of increasing complexity. The administrative historian A.H.M. Jones documented this expansion in extraordinary detail in his monumental study of the later Roman Empire, showing that the number of government officials roughly quadrupled between the reign of Diocletian and the reign of Justinian. The bureaucracy grew, the administrative overhead increased, the proportion of the empire's economic resources consumed by the management and administration of the system, rather than the defense of the borders or the maintenance of the public infrastructure that served the population, rose steadily and inexorably, and the physical infrastructure of the empire, the roads, The aqueducts, the public buildings, the defensive walls deteriorated as the resources needed to maintain them were redirected to the expanding administrative apparatus. The parallel with Abusir is almost exact. The system grew, the monuments declined, the paperwork thrived while the stone crumbled. The Byzantine Empire provides another parallel that is even more directly relevant to the Abusir story. The Byzantines inherited the Roman administrative tradition and elaborated it to an extraordinary degree of sophistication, creating a bureaucratic apparatus that regulated every aspect of imperial life, from the order of precedence at court ceremonies to the management of the grain supply to the regulation of foreign trade. The Byzantine court ceremonial, documented in exhaustive detail by the Emperor Constantine VII in his 10th century treatise on imperial ceremonies, was an institution of staggering complexity, requiring hundreds of officials, each with precisely defined roles and responsibilities, to execute rituals that could last for hours and that required absolute precision in their performance. The ceremonial was, in its own way, the Byzantine equivalent of the Abusir Papyri, a system of institutional management so elaborate and so precisely documented that it dwarfed the physical monuments it was designed to sustain. And the physical monuments of the Byzantine period, while often beautiful, were generally smaller, less structurally ambitious, and less materially lavish than those of the earlier Roman period. The Hagia Sophia is a magnificent exception, but the general trajectory of Byzantine monumental architecture was towards smaller buildings, cheaper materials, and less structural ambition, accompanied by an explosion of institutional complexity that consumed an ever larger share of the state's resources. The math is striking. The Fourth Dynasty of Egypt, the High Roman Empire, and the early Byzantine period each represent a moment of maximum monumental output, when the resources of the state were concentrated on physical construction and the institutional overhead was relatively modest. The Fifth Dynasty, the later Roman Empire, and the Middle Byzantine period each represent a subsequent phase in which institutional complexity expanded dramatically while monumental output declined. The pattern is not identical in every case. The specific mechanisms differ, the timescales differ, the cultural contexts differ, but the structural dynamic is the same. As institutions grow, monuments shrink, because institutions and monuments compete for the same pool of resources, and institutions, being self-perpetuating and self-expanding, tend to win the competition over time. There is a civilization in the Americas that provides perhaps the most illuminating parallel of all, because it demonstrates the same dynamic in a completely independent cultural context, without any possibility of direct influence or shared tradition. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica experienced a trajectory of monumental change that mirrors the Abusir pattern with eerie precision. During the early Classic period, roughly the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the major Maya cities of the southern lowlands built massive pyramid temples of solid stone and rubble fill, towering structures that rose above the jungle canopy, and that served as the platforms for temples and royal tombs. The construction was monumental, the engineering was sophisticated, the investment of labor and materials was enormous. But during the late Classic period, roughly the 7th through 9th centuries, the monumental building programs of the major Maya cities underwent a significant transformation. The pyramids continued to be built, but they were increasingly accompanied by elaborate palace complexes, administrative buildings, and ceremonial precincts that consumed a growing share of the construction budget. The proportion of resources devoted to palace architecture, to the physical infrastructure of governance and administration, increased at the expense of the pyramid temples that had been the dominant architectural form of the earlier period. The American archaeologist David Webster has argued that this shift from temple to palace architecture in the late Classic Maya world reflects a fundamental change in the nature of Maya political authority, a transition from a system based on the personal charisma and ritual authority of the king to a system based on institutional structures of governance that required permanent physical infrastructure to sustain them. The palace complexes that proliferated during the late Classic period housed not just the royal family, but the entire apparatus of court life. scribes, administrators, diplomats, tribute collectors, military officers, and the servants who maintained the physical complex itself. The palace was, in Maya terms, the equivalent of the Abusir administrative system, a permanent institutional infrastructure that required ongoing investment and that competed with the monumental building program for the state's limited resources. And the result, as at Abusir, was a reduction in the scale and quality of the monumental architecture that had defined the civilization's identity. The classic Maya collapse, the abandonment of the major southern lowland cities between roughly 800 and 900 AD, has been attributed to many causes, including drought, warfare, deforestation, and social upheaval. But the institutional dimension of the collapse deserves attention in the context of the Abusir analogy. The late classic Maya states had developed levels of institutional complexity that required enormous resources to maintain. The palace complexes needed staffing, the administrative systems needed funding, the ritual calendars needed provisioning, the diplomatic networks needed sustaining. When environmental stress, probably in the form of severe droughts documented in paleoclimatic records from the Yucatan Peninsula, reduced the agricultural surplus available to fund these institutions, the system could not simplify itself quickly enough to survive. The institutional overhead that had been manageable during periods of abundance became unsustainable during periods of scarcity. The system was too complex to maintain and too rigid to reform, and the civilization that had built it collapsed, leaving behind the ruins of monumental architecture that was already, by the time the collapse occurred, playing second fiddle to the institutional systems that were consuming the resources it needed to survive. Closer to home in the Egyptian archaeological record, the trajectory visible at Abusir continued into the Sixth Dynasty and accelerated during the First Intermediate Period. The Pyramids of the Sixth Dynasty, built at Saqqara by kings like Teti, Pepi I, Merenre, and Pepi II, continued the trend toward rubble-fill construction, and their cores have deteriorated even more severely than those at Abusir. But the Sixth Dynasty also saw the continued expansion of the administrative and priestly classes, with high officials building increasingly elaborate tombs and accumulating increasingly grandiose titles that reflected their growing share of the state's resources. The autobiography of Weni, a Sixth Dynasty official who served under 3 successive kings, describes a career of steadily increasing responsibility and influence, from minor functionary to military commander to governor of Upper Egypt, a trajectory that reflects the expanding scope and complexity of the administrative state. Weni's tomb, while not at Abusir, is part of the same pattern of institutional growth that the Abusir Papyri document. The bureaucracy was expanding, the official class was growing. The resources that sustained both were being drawn from the same finite pool that had once been devoted primarily to pyramid construction. The reign of Pepi II, traditionally regarded as the longest reign in Egyptian history, possibly lasting as long as 60 or even 90 years, according to the ancient king lists, though modern scholars tend toward more conservative estimates, represents the endpoint of this trajectory. By the time of Pepi II's death, around 2150 BC according to the conventional chronology, the institutional structures of the Old Kingdom had expanded to a point where they consumed virtually all of the state's available resources. The provincial governors had become hereditary lords, with their own courts, their own armies, and their own building programs that rivaled those of the king himself. The priestly endowments had accumulated enormous estates that were exempt from royal taxation and that represented a permanent drain on the agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley. The administrative overhead of the pyramid cults, maintained for multiple generations of dead kings stretching back centuries, had grown into a permanent fiscal burden that the living king could not reduce without violating the sacred obligations that sustained the cosmic order and that provided the theological justification for kingship itself. The system had become self-perpetuating and self-consuming, a bureaucratic organism that existed primarily to sustain itself and its accumulated obligations, and that had definitively outgrown the productive capacity of the economy that supported it. The American sociologist Manka Olson has described this dynamic in terms that apply with remarkable precision to the late Old Kingdom. Olson argued that stable societies tend to accumulate what he called distributional coalitions, groups that have acquired claims on the society's resources and that use their institutional position to defend those claims against reform. Over time, these coalitions consume an increasing share of the society's productive output, reducing the resources available for investment, innovation, and adaptation. The society becomes sclerotic, unable to reform itself, because every reform threatens the interests of a coalition that has the institutional power to resist change. The pyramid cults of the Old Kingdom were, in Olson's terms, distributional coalitions of the most entrenched and most resistant kind. Each cult had a dedicated endowment consisting of agricultural estates that produced a permanent stream of income. Each cult had a permanent staff of priests organized in rotating shifts, each priest with a personal stake in the continuation of the cult that provided his livelihood. Each cult had a theological justification for its continued existence that made reform not merely politically difficult, but theologically impermissible. Reducing or abolishing a cult was tantamount to condemning the dead king to eternal oblivion, an act of cosmic vandalism that no living pharaoh could contemplate without risking his own legitimacy and his own prospects for an eternal afterlife. And so the cults accumulated, generation after generation, each one consuming resources that the living king could not redirect to more productive purposes, until the cumulative burden of maintaining the dead overwhelmed the productive capacity of the living. The numbers are striking. By the end of the Sixth Dynasty, the Egyptian state was maintaining pyramid cults for kings stretching back more than 400 years, from Sneferu through Pepi II. Each cult required a temple staff, a supply chain, agricultural estates, and administrative oversight. The total cost of maintaining these cults, accumulated over centuries, represented a fiscal obligation that grew with each generation and that could never be reduced without violating the theological principles that justified the system's existence. The system was designed to grow without limit, to accumulate obligations without any mechanism for shedding them, to expand its institutional footprint with each successive generation, while never contracting, never simplifying, never reducing its claims on the finite agricultural surplus that sustained the entire edifice. It had no mechanism for contraction, and the civilization that created it eventually discovered, through the painful and prolonged experience of the first intermediate period, that a system designed to grow without limit will eventually consume the society that sustains it, leaving behind a landscape of ruined monuments and abandoned institutions that testify, in their silence, to the price of unchecked institutional growth. The forgotten ones who built the rubble-filled pyramids of Abusir, the quarrymen who cut the rough blocks, the labourers who hauled the sand and gravel, the masons who dressed the casing stones, the scribes who kept the accounts, the priests who maintained the cult. These are a people we can no longer name individually, but we can see the world they created, a world of institutional sophistication concealing physical compromise, a world of administrative excellence serving architectural mediocrity, a world of paperwork and rubble. They did their work, they believed it mattered, they went home, and the pyramids they built, the monuments they devoted their lives to constructing, are crumbling into the desert while the papyri they produced, the administrative records they filed and forgot, have become some of the most important documents in the history of human civilization. The irony is not lost on history. The throwaway paperwork outlasted the monuments, the filing system survived the temple, and the people who filled out the forms are remembered, imperfectly, through the forms they filled out, while the people who built the pyramids are forgotten entirely. But the story of Abusir extends beyond the pyramids of the kings. The necropolis also contains the tombs and pyramids of queens, and their monuments tell a story that complicates and enriches the narrative of institutional growth and monumental decline. The pyramid complex of Khentkaus II, a queen of the Fifth Dynasty, who may have been the wife of Neferirkare, was discovered and excavated by the Czech expedition in the 1970s and 80s. Khentkaus's pyramid is small, with a base of roughly 18 meters, but it follows the canonical plan of a royal pyramid complex in miniature, with its own mortuary temple, its own offering chapel, and its own attendant structures. The discovery of this complex was significant because it demonstrated that the queens of the Fifth Dynasty were provided with pyramid complexes of their own, a practice that implies a level of royal investment in female funerary monuments that had not been fully appreciated before the Czech excavations. But the real significance of Kentkaus II's complex lies not in its architecture, but in the inscription found on one of its blocks. The inscription gives Kentkaus a title that has been translated as Mother of Two Kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, a designation that, if taken literally, identifies her as the mother of two pharaohs. The identity of these two kings has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. The most commonly accepted identification links them to Neferirkare and Djoser, both of whom built their pyramids at Abusir. If this identification is correct, it means that Kentkaus was one of the most politically important women of the Fifth Dynasty, a queen mother whose sons ruled Egypt in succession and whose position at the center of the royal family gave her a degree of influence that is reflected in the provision of her own pyramid complex. The Queen's pyramids at Abusir are part of a broader pattern of elite tomb construction that reveals the expanding distribution of monumental resources during the Fifth Dynasty. The high officials of the period built increasingly elaborate tombs. The provincial governors accumulated increasingly grand titles and increasingly extensive estates, and the priestly class expanded its claims on the agricultural surplus of the royal endowments. Each of these developments represented a transfer of resources from the central royal building program to the broader elite, a redistribution that enriched the periphery at the expense of the center. The king's pyramid got smaller, the officials' tombs got larger, the queens got their own pyramid complexes, the priests got permanent endowments, and the system as a whole became more complex, more expensive, more institutionally elaborate, and less capable of concentrating resources on a single overwhelming monument. The archaeological site of Abusir today reflects this diffusion of monumental energy with painful clarity. The pyramids of the kings are ruined mounds of rubble, their casings stripped, their cores exposed, their original forms barely recognizable. But the tombs of the officials scattered around the royal pyramids, while also damaged, contain some of the finest art and most informative inscriptions of the Old Kingdom. The tomb of Tarshepses, the great vizier who married into the royal family, is a monument of such size and elaboration that it rivals the mortuary temples of the kings themselves. The reliefs in Tarshepses' tomb depict scenes of daily life, agriculture, craftsmanship, music, dance, and feasting that are among the most vivid and most frequently reproduced images from the ancient Egyptian world. These scenes tell us more about the daily realities of Old Kingdom life than any royal monument, because they depict not the frozen rituals of divine kingship, but the messy, dynamic, human activities of a living society. The officials' tombs are, in a sense, the real Abusir, the part of the site that speaks most directly to us across the millennia, while the royal pyramids, the monuments that were supposed to be eternal, have collapsed into the anonymity of rubble. The archaeological exploration of Abusir is far from complete. The Czech expedition continues to work at the site, and new discoveries are made regularly. In recent decades, excavations have uncovered previously unknown tomb complexes, additional fragments of the Abusir Papyri, and evidence for construction activities that extend the chronological range of the site well beyond the Fifth Dynasty. Tombs from the 26th Dynasty, more than 2,000 years after the Fifth Dynasty pyramids were built, have been found at Abusir, indicating that the site retained some degree of sacred significance long after the original pyramid cults had ceased to function. The 26th Dynasty, known as the Sate period, was itself a period of deliberate archaism, a time when Egyptian artists and administrators consciously looked back to the Old Kingdom as a golden age and attempted to revive its artistic styles, its religious practices, and its administrative forms. The choice of Abusir as a burial site during this period suggests that the memory of the Fifth Dynasty, however distorted by the passage of 2 millennia, still carried cultural weight, still evoked associations with a legitimate and admirable past, still offered the dead a connection to the deep traditions of Egyptian civilization. This continuity of use across more than 2,000 years is itself a remarkable testament to the enduring power of sacred geography in the Egyptian world. The pyramids of Abusir may be rubble, the temples may be ruins, the causeways may be reduced to cuttings in the bedrock, but the site itself, the piece of desert plateau overlooking the Nile Valley that the Fifth Dynasty kings chose for their eternal resting place, retains a quality that the physical monuments no longer possess, the quality of place, of location, of connection to a landscape that human beings have considered sacred for more than 4,500 years. The monuments decay, the place endures, and the endurance of the place, long after the monuments have crumbled, tells us something important about the nature of sacredness and the relationship between human meaning and physical geography. We invest places with significance. The significance outlasts the structures we build to express it. The rubble decays, the ground remains. The forgotten status of Abusir in the modern world is itself part of the story. The site receives a tiny fraction of the visitors who flock to Giza, even though it is located only a few kilometers to the south and is easily accessible from Cairo. The reasons for this neglect are not hard to understand. The pyramids at Abusir do not photograph well. They are not visually impressive. They do not have the overwhelming scale of the Giza monuments or the dramatic setting of the Valley of the Kings. A tourist standing at the base of Sahure's pyramid, looking up at a mound of loose rubble that bears no resemblance to the gleaming geometric form it once possessed, is unlikely to feel the awe that a visitor to Giza experiences standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid. Abusir is, by the standards of tourist appeal, a failure, a site whose physical remains are so degraded that they cannot compete for attention with the more photogenic ruins that surround them. But the forgetting of Abusir is not merely a failure of tourism. It is a failure of historical understanding, a consequence of the bias that leads us to judge civilizations by their visible monuments rather than their institutional achievements. We remember the Fourth Dynasty because it built the Great Pyramid. We forget the Fifth Dynasty because it built rubble-filled pyramids. But the Fifth Dynasty created the earliest known bureaucratic archives in human history. It developed administrative systems of a sophistication that would not be matched for centuries. It produced art of exceptional quality. It built sun temples that represented a theological revolution in the relationship between the king and the cosmos. It maintained a system of royal cult management that was, by any measure of institutional complexity, more sophisticated than anything the Fourth Dynasty had achieved. And all of this is forgotten, overlooked, dismissed, because the pyramids are small and the rubble is not photogenic. The bias is not confined to popular culture. Even within Egyptology, the Fifth Dynasty has traditionally received less scholarly attention than the Fourth Dynasty or the New Kingdom, the two periods that have produced the most visually spectacular monuments. The Abusir excavations, particularly those conducted by the Czech expedition, have done much to correct this imbalance, but the perception persists that the Fifth Dynasty is a lesser period, a time of decline that separates the glories of the Pyramid Age from the artistic achievements of the later Old Kingdom. This perception is, as the Abusir evidence demonstrates, fundamentally mistaken. The Fifth Dynasty was not a period of decline. It was a period of transformation, a time when the Egyptian state redirected its resources from monumental construction to institutional development, from the visible to the invisible, from the permanent to the procedural. The transformation was consequential. It shaped the trajectory of Egyptian civilization for centuries to come, and it has been misunderstood precisely because it produced achievements that are recorded on papyrus rather than carved in stone. The lesson of Abusir for the modern world is that the most important changes in a civilization's trajectory are often the least visible. The shift from solid stone to rubble fill was invisible as long as the casing remained intact. The expansion of the administrative system was invisible to anyone who was not reading the papyri. The redistribution of resources from the pyramid to the periphery was invisible to anyone who was not counting the blocks. The changes happened beneath the surface, behind the facade, inside the system, and they were not recognized for what they were until the casing was stripped away and the rubble was exposed. By then, it was too late. The solid core was already gone. The institutional complexity that had replaced it could not be put back, and the civilization that had made the trade-off, monuments for institutions, stone for papyrus, permanence for procedure, was left with a landscape of crumbling pyramids and a filing system that no one would read for 4,000 years. The wind blows across the Abusir plateau, the rubble settles, the tourists do not come, and the papyri, stored in climate-controlled archives in Prague and Cairo, wait for the next scholar to unfold them, to read the duty rosters and the offering lists and the inspection reports that document, in meticulous bureaucratic detail, the daily operations of a system that worked perfectly, that functioned with admirable efficiency, and that served monuments that were all ready from the day they were sealed behind their gleaming white casings, filled with nothing but rubble. There is a moment, late at night, when the intellectual framework falls away and the emotional reality of what Abusir represents becomes personal. It stops being about rubble-filled construction and administrative papyri and the institutional dynamics of complex societies. It starts being about the world you live in, the buildings you inhabit, the systems you depend on, the assumptions you make about the permanence of things that seem solid, but that you have never actually inspected from the inside. That is the moment when the exposed rubble core of Sahure's pyramid stops being an archaeological curiosity and becomes a metaphor that you cannot unsee. Because the deeper truth of Abusir is not about ancient Egypt. It is about the universal human tendency to maintain appearances while the substance behind them degrades. It is about the way complex societies learn to preserve the form of their achievements while quietly replacing their content with something cheaper, something faster, something that looks the same from the outside, but that will not survive the moment the protective facade is removed. The rubble-filled pyramid is not a uniquely Egyptian phenomenon. It is a pattern that repeats across every civilization that has ever experienced the transition from youthful vigor to institutional maturity, from the concentrated energies of the founding phase to the distributed burdens of the maintenance phase, from the era when everything is built for the first time to the era when everything must be maintained forever. Let that sink in. The Pyramids of Abusir were not built by a failing civilization. They were built by a civilization at the peak of its institutional sophistication, a civilization that had mastered the art of large-scale administration, and that was applying that mastery to every aspect of its existence. The bureaucracy worked, the supply chains functioned, the rotation systems turned, the accounts balanced, the inspections were conducted, the reports were filed, and inside the pyramids, behind the polished casings that maintained the appearance of Fourth Dynasty grandeur, the cores were rubble. This is not science fiction. This is the documented archaeological reality of one of the most important transitional periods in the history of human civilization. And the question it forces us to ask is not whether the same pattern exists in the modern world, because it obviously does, but whether we would recognize it if we saw it, whether we would understand what the rubble behind the casing means before the casing is stripped away and the compromise is exposed for all to see. The American author and social critic Lewis Mumford, writing in the middle of the 20th century, described what he called the mega-machine, the organizational apparatus that complex societies create to coordinate large-scale collective action. The mega-machine, in Mumford's formulation, is not a physical machine but a social one, a system of human relationships organized for the purpose of executing projects that no individual or small group could accomplish alone. The Egyptian state that built the pyramids was, in Mumford's terms, the first mega-machine, the first society to organize human labor on a scale sufficient to produce monuments of genuinely superhuman proportions. What the Abusir evidence reveals is what happens when the mega-machine evolves, when it shifts from producing physical output to producing institutional output, when it redirects its energies from the construction of monuments to the management of systems, and when the systems it manages become more impressive, more complex, and more resource-intensive than the monuments they were designed to serve. The modern world provides abundant examples of this dynamic examples so familiar that they have become almost invisible, like the rubble behind the casing. Consider the contemporary construction industry. In many developed countries, the quality of residential construction has declined significantly over the past several decades, even as the regulatory apparatus governing construction has become vastly more complex. Building codes have expanded, inspection regimes have multiplied, compliance requirements have proliferated. The institutional infrastructure surrounding the act of building a house is more elaborate, more expensive, and more time-consuming than at any previous point in history. And yet the houses themselves are by many material measures less durable than their predecessors. They are built with cheaper materials. They are assembled more quickly. They are designed for shorter lifespans. The institutional overhead has grown. The physical product has declined. The parallel with Abusir is almost too precise to require commentary. Consider the academic world. Universities have expanded their administrative staffs dramatically over the past half-century, adding layers of management, compliance, assessment, and support services that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of scholars. The institutional apparatus of the modern university is more complex, more professionalized, and more expensive than anything the academic world has ever seen. And yet the core activity of the university, the education of students and the production of original research, faces persistent criticism for declining quality, reduced rigor, and diminishing public trust. The administrative casing is polished and impressive. The educational core is, in many assessments, rubble. The system runs smoothly. The output is compromised. Consider infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers has repeatedly assessed the condition of American infrastructure, roads, bridges, dams, water systems, electrical grids, and has repeatedly found that the physical condition of this infrastructure is deteriorating at a rate that outpaces repair and maintenance. The institutional systems that manage this infrastructure, the planning agencies, the regulatory bodies, the procurement processes, the environmental review procedures, are more elaborate and more expensive than ever before. But the physical infrastructure itself is degrading. The management systems are growing. The things being managed are shrinking. The casing is expanding. The core is crumbling. Let that sink in. The pattern that the rubble-filled pyramids of Abusir document is not an ancient curiosity. It is a contemporary reality. It is the structural dynamic of every mature civilization that has reached the phase of institutional self-elaboration, the phase where the systems designed to manage the output become more expensive than the output itself, where the overhead consumes the product, where the administration grows while the achievement shrinks. This is not a conspiracy. It is not a failure of leadership. It is not the result of laziness or corruption, though laziness and corruption can accelerate it. It is a structural feature of complex societies, as predictable and as inevitable as the deterioration of a rubble-filled core once its protective casing is removed. The grief moment of the Abusir story is not the crumbling pyramids. It is the recognition that the people who built them did not know what they were doing. They did not understand that they were building rubble-filled monuments for eternity. They believed, with the absolute confidence of people who cannot see behind the casing, that their pyramids were as solid as those of their predecessors. The casing looked the same. The form was the same. The height was respectable. The temple was beautiful. The system was professional. Everything, from the outside, looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. And inside, invisible and unsuspected, the core was rubble. We assume that what we build will outlast us. The ruins suggest otherwise. Every monument is a bet against time, and time has never lost. But the specific lesson of Abusir goes beyond the generic observation that all things decay. The Abusir's lesson is that some things decay from the inside out, that the most dangerous form of decline is the form that is invisible to those experiencing it, that a civilization can be filling its cores with rubble while its casings remain flawless, and that the moment of exposure, the moment when the casing is stripped away and the rubble is revealed, comes not as a surprise to the civilization, but as a surprise to the historians who assumed, from the exterior evidence, that everything was still solid. The workers who filled the cores of the Abusir pyramids with rubble were not cheating. They were following instructions. They were using the construction technique that their architects had specified and that their supervisors had approved. The rubble fill was not a deviation from the plan. It was the plan. The civilization had decided, collectively and rationally, that rubble fill was an acceptable substitute for solid stone, and the workers executed that decision with the same professionalism and the same institutional precision that characterized everything the Fifth Dynasty did. The papyri record the smooth functioning of the system. The rubble records the quality of the output, and the gap between the two, between the excellence of the system and the mediocrity of the product, is the gap that defines the Abusir paradox and that haunts every civilization that has ever confused institutional sophistication with substantive achievement. The desert wind blows across the Abusir plateau, carrying sand into the exposed cores of pyramids that were supposed to last forever. The rubble shifts and settles. A block loosens and slides down the slope of the ruined core, coming to rest in the sand at the base of the monument. No one sees it fall. No one has watched these pyramids for centuries. They stand alone, forgotten, crumbling, their casings gone, their rubble exposed, their story written not in the stone that remains, but in the papyrus that was found among the ruins and that has outlasted the monuments by a margin that grows wider with every passing year. The deeper truth of Abusir extends into territory that most archaeological discussions prefer to avoid, because it raises questions about the nature of progress itself. The conventional narrative of human civilization is a narrative of advancement. Each generation builds on the achievements of the previous one, accumulating knowledge, refining technique, expanding capability until the cumulative result is a world of extraordinary complexity and power. The Pyramids of Giza represent, in this narrative, an early triumph of human ingenuity, surpassed by later achievements but never diminished in their foundational importance. The rubble-filled Pyramids of Abusir represent, in this same narrative, a lesser achievement, a decline from the peak of Fourth Dynasty construction, a step down from the standards set by Khufu and Khafre. But the Abusir Papyri challenge this narrative in a way that is profoundly uncomfortable. The administrative systems documented in the papyri are not lesser achievements. They are different achievements, achievements in a different medium, expressed in a different language, operating on a different scale. The duty rosters, the offering lists, the inspection reports, the correspondence between temple and court, these documents record an institutional accomplishment that is, in its own way, as impressive as the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid required the coordination of tens of thousands of workers over decades. The administrative system documented in the Abusir Papyri required the coordination of hundreds of institutions over centuries. The Great Pyramid was a single project with a single goal. The administrative system was an ongoing operation with multiple goals, multiple stakeholders, and multiple competing demands on finite resources. The Great Pyramid was finished. The administrative system was never finished. It ran continuously, maintaining itself and its obligations in perpetuity, adapting to changing circumstances, absorbing new responsibilities, growing more complex with each generation. Which of these is the greater achievement? The question has no simple answer, and that is precisely the point. We are biased toward the visible. We admire the monument and overlook the institution. We celebrate the builder and forget the administrator. We measure greatness in height and mass and geometric precision, and we dismiss the filing system that kept the whole operation running. But the filing system outlasted the monument. The papyrus outlived the stone. The administrative record survived when the pyramid collapsed. And the fact that we must rely on the administrative record to understand the monument, rather than the other way around, tells us something that our civilizational biases make it very difficult to accept. That the invisible achievement may have been the more durable one, the more significant one, the one that actually deserves to be remembered. The British historian Arnold Toynbee, in his monumental study of the rise and fall of civilizations, described what he called the challenge and response mechanism of civilizational development. Civilizations grow, in Toynbee's formulation, by successfully responding to challenges, environmental, military, social, that test their adaptive capacity. They decline when they can no longer generate creative responses to new challenges, when their institutional structures become so rigid and so heavily invested in existing solutions that they cannot adapt to changed circumstances. The transition from Fourth Dynasty to Fifth Dynasty Egypt can be read as a successful response to a specific challenge, the challenge of maintaining the pyramid tradition in the face of expanding institutional commitments and diversifying theological priorities. The Fifth Dynasty responded by innovating, by developing the rubble fill technique, by creating the Sun Temple as a new kind of royal monument, by expanding the administrative apparatus to manage an increasingly complex system. The response was creative. The response was effective. The system adapted and survived. But the adaptation came at a cost measured in the quality of the pyramids, the substance behind the casings, the rubble inside the shells. The response worked, but it was not free. Every civilization that reaches the phase of institutional maturity faces the same challenge, and every civilization responds in essentially the same way, by maintaining the forms of its foundational achievements, while gradually replacing their substance with something more manageable, more sustainable, more compatible with the expanded institutional commitments that maturity entails. The forms persist, the substance degrades, the casing remains intact while the core fills with rubble, and the civilization, looking at its own achievements from the outside, sees polished surfaces and regular geometry and concludes that everything is solid, everything is permanent, everything is as it has always been. The rubble is invisible, the compromise is hidden, and the illusion of continuity persists until the moment, which always comes eventually, when the casing cracks and the truth is revealed. The ancient Egyptians had a concept that is relevant here. They called it Mat, usually translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, and it referred to the fundamental principle of rightness that sustained the universe. Mat was not merely an ethical ideal, it was an ontological reality, the force that held the cosmos together and that prevented the world from dissolving into chaos. The king's primary responsibility was to maintain Mat, to ensure that the cosmic order was sustained through the proper performance of rituals, the just administration of the state, and the construction of monuments that embodied the permanence and stability that Mat required. The rubble-fill pyramid was, in this theological framework, a violation of Ma'at, a monument that claimed permanence while concealing impermanence, that presented the appearance of cosmic stability while harboring structural instability within. Whether the Fifth Dynasty Egyptians perceived it this way is impossible to know. The casing concealed the compromise. The ritual continued. The papyri recorded the smooth functioning of the system, and Mat, from the outside at least, appeared to be intact. But Mat was not intact. The rubble was real, the compromise was physical, and the civilization that maintained the appearance of cosmic order while filling its foundations with debris was, in a profound and literal sense, building on sand. The casing would eventually be removed, the rubble would eventually be exposed, and the cosmic order that the pyramid was supposed to embody would be revealed as a shell, a form without substance, a shape without structure, a civilization's grandest promise built on a civilization's most fundamental compromise. There is another dimension to the Abusir story that has not yet been fully explored, and it concerns the loss of craft knowledge that accompanied the transition from solid stone to rubble-fill construction. When the Fifth Dynasty builders adopted the rubble-fill technique, they did not merely change a construction method, they broke a chain of transmitted expertise that had been accumulating for generations. The quarrymen who cut the precisely dimensioned blocks for the Great Pyramid possessed skills that had been developed and refined over decades of continuous practice. They could read the grain of the limestone, anticipate fracture lines, adjust their cutting angles to compensate for variations in the stone's density and composition. The skills were not theoretical in nature. They could not be learned from a text or a diagram or a set of written instructions, however detailed. They were embodied knowledge, stored in the hands and eyes and reflexes of individual craftsmen who had spent years under the tutelage of master quarrymen. When the demand for precisely cut blocks declined, when rubble fill replaced the need for uniform, carefully dimensioned stones, The economic incentive to train new quarrymen in the old techniques disappeared. The masters retired. The apprentices were not recruited. The knowledge was not transmitted. And within a generation, the specific skills needed to build a solid stone pyramid were lost, not through catastrophe or conquest, but through the simple mechanics of disuse. This is a pattern that modern economists call skill atrophy, and it is one of the most insidious forms of knowledge loss in any complex society. Skills that are not practiced are forgotten. Techniques that are not taught are lost. Capabilities that are not exercised decay. The process is gradual, invisible, and almost impossible to reverse once it has reached a certain point, because the knowledge that has been lost is precisely the knowledge needed to recognize and correct the loss. A civilization that has forgotten how to cut stone to Fourth Dynasty standards does not know what it has forgotten, because the people who would have been able to identify the gap no longer exist. The loss is not felt as a loss. It is experienced as normality, as the way things are, as the way things have always been. The rubble fill is not perceived as a compromise. It is perceived as a technique, as a method, as the standard way of building a pyramid. The memory of the solid stone fades. The rubble becomes the baseline, and the civilization moves forward without understanding what it has left behind. The modern world is experiencing its own version of this skill atrophy in domains that are eerily similar to the ancient Egyptian case. The ability to build large-scale infrastructure projects on time and on budget has declined in many developed countries over the past several decades. The cost of building a mile of subway track in New York City has increased by orders of magnitude in real terms since the original subway system was first constructed in the early 20th century, a fact that has been documented by researchers at multiple institutions, and that has generated intense debate about the causes of infrastructure cost inflation in developed economies. The time required to complete major infrastructure projects has expanded dramatically. The institutional apparatus surrounding the construction process, the environmental reviews, the regulatory approvals, the community consultations, the legal challenges, has become so elaborate and so time-consuming that the actual act of building has become a minor component of the overall project timeline. The administrative casing has expanded enormously. The construction core has shrunk. The parallel with Abusir requires no elaboration. The question that Abusir ultimately asks is not whether our civilization is experiencing the same dynamic. It obviously is. The question is whether we can see it, whether we can recognize the rubble behind the casing before the casing is stripped away, whether we can identify the patterns of institutional overgrowth and productive decline that the archaeological record documents with such painful clarity before those patterns produce consequences that we cannot reverse. The Fifth Dynasty Egyptians could not see the rubble inside their pyramids. They could not perceive the institutional dynamics that were reshaping their civilization from within. They could not recognize that the trade-off they were making, institutions for monuments, systems for structures, paperwork for permanence, would produce a legacy that looked 4,500 years later like failure. They saw polished casings, they saw functioning systems, they saw a world that was working, and they assumed, as every generation assumes, that what was working would continue to work, that the casings would hold, that the rubble would remain hidden, and that the system they had built was as solid as the stone they believed their pyramids were made of. The ruins at Abusir are the answer to that assumption. The casings did not hold. The rubble was exposed. The system did not continue to work. And the civilization that built the world's first bureaucracy and the world's first rubble-filled pyramids left behind a landscape that tells two stories simultaneously. The story of institutional achievement, written in papyrus and preserved in archives, and the story of physical compromise, written in rubble and exposed to the desert wind. Both stories are true, both are important, and the tension between them, the irresolvable tension between the excellence of the system and the mediocrity of the product, is the deepest and most lasting lesson that the Forgotten Royal Necropolis of Abusir has to offer. Step back now from the rubble and the papyri and the duty rosters and the offering lists, and look at the full arc of what has been described. because the story of Abusir is not, in the end, a story about ancient Egypt. It is a story about the relationship between a civilization's visible achievements and its invisible infrastructure, between the things it builds for the world to see and the systems it creates to manage those things, and about what happens when the systems outgrow the things they were designed to manage. We live in a world that has perfected this dynamic. Our institutions are more complex, more professionalized, more thoroughly documented, and more expensive to maintain than those of any previous civilization. Our regulatory frameworks span millions of pages. Our compliance systems employ millions of people. Our management structures layer hierarchy upon hierarchy, each layer generating its own documentation, its own metrics, its own reporting requirements, its own administrative overhead. The institutional casing of the modern world is polished to a brilliant shine. It is comprehensive, it is sophisticated, it is expensive. And the question that Abusir forces us to ask is, what lies behind it? What the core looks like when the casing is removed, whether the substance matches the surface, whether the output justifies the overhead. The question is not rhetorical. It has practical consequences that affect the daily lives of billions of people. When a hospital's administrative costs consume a larger and larger share of its budget, the resources available for patient care decline, even as the administrative systems that manage the hospital become more sophisticated and more elaborate. When a government agency's compliance requirements consume more time and attention than the actual work the agency was created to perform, the quality of the agency's output declines, even as the quality of its internal documentation improves. When a construction project spends more money on regulatory compliance, environmental review, and legal defense than on the actual construction of the physical structure, the project takes longer, costs more, and produces a less durable result, even as the institutional framework surrounding it becomes a model of procedural thoroughness. These are not hypothetical examples. They are documented realities of the modern administrative state, and they mirror the pattern visible at Abusir with a precision that should give us pause. The digital world provides its own version of the Abusir dynamic, and it is perhaps the most relevant parallel for a generation that increasingly lives, works, and creates in digital environments. The software industry has developed a term for the phenomenon of institutional complexity outgrowing productive output. They call it bloat. Software bloat occurs when a program accumulates so many features, so many modules, so many layers of code designed to manage, monitor, and optimize the program's performance that the program becomes slower, less reliable, and less efficient than its simpler predecessors. Each additional feature is individually justified. Each additional layer of management code is individually rational. But the cumulative effect is a product that consumes more resources, runs more slowly, and crashes more frequently than the leaner, simpler version it replaced. The administrative casing has expanded. The functional core has degraded. The system is more sophisticated. The product is worse. The parallel extends to the digital infrastructure that sustains the modern world. Cloud computing platforms, data centers, and network architectures have achieved levels of institutional complexity that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. The management systems that monitor, optimize, and maintain these platforms are themselves vast engineering achievements, employing thousands of specialists and consuming billions of dollars in annual expenditure. But the reliability of the underlying infrastructure, measured by uptime, data integrity, and resistance to catastrophic failure, has not improved in proportion to the investment in management. The casing has become more elaborate. The core has not become more solid, and the gap between the sophistication of the management system and the reliability of the thing being managed grows wider with each passing year. The pharmaceutical industry offers another contemporary parallel that illuminates the Abusir pattern from a different angle. The regulatory apparatus governing drug development has expanded enormously over the past half-century, with each new layer of regulation adding cost, time, and institutional complexity to the process of bringing a new medication to market. The average cost of developing a new drug has increased from roughly $100 million in the 1970s to more than $2 billion today, adjusted for inflation. The time required has roughly doubled. The administrative overhead, the regulatory filings, the clinical trial management, the compliance documentation now constitutes the majority of the total development cost, and yet the number of new drugs approved each year has not increased proportionally. The system is more elaborate. The output has not grown commensurately. The institutional casing is magnificent. The productive core is struggling to justify the investment. The Fifth Dynasty built magnificent administrative systems and rubble-fill pyramids. The modern world builds magnificent administrative systems and infrastructure, whose quality, by many measures, is declining relative to the administrative investment required to produce it. The parallel is not exact. The mechanisms are different, the scale is different, the cultural context is different. But the structural dynamic is the same. Institutions grow, output shrinks, and the gap between the polish of the system and the quality of the product widens with each passing generation. The philosopher Ivan Illich wrote about what he called counterproductivity, the phenomenon by which institutions designed to serve a specific purpose eventually become obstacles to the achievement of that purpose. Schools, designed to educate, can become so institutionally complex that they impede the very learning they were created to foster. Hospitals, designed to heal, can become so administratively burdensome that they impede the healthcare they exist to provide. Transportation systems, designed to move people efficiently from one place to another, can become so regulated, so expensive, and so procedurally elaborate that they impede the mobility they were created to enable. In every case, the institution that was created to serve a function has grown beyond the function and has become, in Illich's terms, counterproductive, consuming more resources than it produces value and creating more obstacles than it removes. The rubble-fill pyramid is the architectural embodiment of counterproductivity, a monument whose institutional support system has grown so elaborate and so resource-intensive that it has consumed the very resources needed to build the monument properly, leaving the institution thriving and the output compromised. The system works with admirable precision. The pyramid is rubble. The institution thrives in its procedural excellence. The output suffers in its physical mediocrity. The paperwork is flawless. The construction is hollow. And the gap between the two, between the quality of the management and the quality of the product being managed, is the gap that defines the Abusir paradox and that haunts every organization that has ever measured its success by the sophistication of its processes, rather than the quality of its results. Illich's concept of counterproductivity extends naturally to the question of whether civilizational complexity itself is subject to diminishing returns, whether there is a critical threshold at which adding more institutional structure produces not more benefit but less, not more organizational capability but more organizational overhead, not more genuine achievement but more management of the appearance and documentation of achievement. Tainter argued that this critical threshold exists, and that reaching it is the primary mechanism through which complex societies enter their phase of terminal decline and eventual collapse or radical simplification. The Abusir evidence supports this argument in a way that Tainter himself did not fully explore in his original formulation, because it provides direct, tangible, physical evidence of the trade-off between institutional complexity and productive output, evidence that is literally and physically embedded in the crumbling fabric of the ruins themselves, visible to anyone willing to look. The ruins at Abusir suggest a cautious but important answer to the question of whether awareness of the pattern is sufficient to change it. The pattern is powerful. The incentives that drive it are strong. The institutional forces that produce rubble-fill construction are the same forces that produce bureaucratic efficiency. And bureaucratic efficiency is, in the short term, a genuine achievement, a real improvement in the management of complex systems. The Fifth Dynasty state was, by any administrative measure, more sophisticated than the Fourth Dynasty state. The papyri prove it. The system worked better. The institutions were more professional. The management was more precise, and the pyramids were rubble. The question for the modern world is whether a civilization can have both: Solid construction and sophisticated administration, durable output and efficient management, substance and system, quality and compliance. The Abusir evidence suggests that sustaining both simultaneously over long periods is extraordinarily difficult. But it also suggests that the attempt is worth making, because the alternative is a legacy of institutional excellence serving architectural mediocrity, of systems that outlast the structures they were designed to serve, of papyrus that survives when stone does not. There is a final dimension of the Abusir story that deserves reflection before we move to the closing, and it concerns the nature of forgetting. The Pyramids of Abusir have been forgotten by popular culture. They are not iconic, they are not photographed, they are not reproduced on postcards, or coffee mugs, or travel posters. They are not discussed in popular documentaries about ancient Egypt, except in passing, as minor monuments that bridge the gap between the glory of Giza and the innovations of Saqqara. This forgetting is itself a form of the bias that the Abusir story is designed to challenge. We forget Abusir because it does not look like what we think a successful civilization should look like. We forget it because its monuments are ruined, because its achievements are documented in papyrus rather than carved in stone, because its story is one of compromise and adaptation rather than triumph and glory. We prefer the story of the Great Pyramid, the story of concentrated resources and overwhelming ambition, producing a monument that has stood for more than 4,500 years. We do not want the story of the rubble-filled pyramid, the story of distributed resources and competing priorities producing a monument that began to collapse the moment its protective surface was removed. But the rubble-filled story is the more important story. It is the story that most civilizations actually live through. The Great Pyramid is the exception. The rubble-filled pyramid is the rule. Most civilizations, most of the time, are not building solid stone monuments with unlimited resources and unlimited labor. They are managing competing demands, balancing institutional growth against productive output, maintaining the appearance of standards while quietly adapting those standards to the reality of diminished resources and expanded obligations. The Great Pyramid tells us what a civilization can achieve at the peak of its concentrated power. The rubble-filled pyramids of Abusir tell us what a civilization actually produces during the long, ordinary, institutionally complex middle period that constitutes the bulk of its existence. And it is the middle period, not the peak, that determines the civilization's long-term trajectory and its ultimate fate. The memory of Abusir should not be allowed to fade. The ruins are not beautiful. The pyramids are not impressive. The site does not reward the casual visitor with the kind of immediate visual spectacle that justifies a detour from the well-worn road to Giza and the Sphinx. But the lessons of Abusir, encoded in rubble and papyrus, in ruined monuments and pristine administrative archives, in the gap between the polish of the system and the quality of the product, in the contrast between the sophistication of the management and the mediocrity of the thing being managed, are lessons that every mature civilization needs to learn, and that no civilization in the recorded history of the human species has ever learned in time to prevent the consequences that the lessons so clearly and so painfully describe. The Pyramids of Abusir stand on the desert plateau halfway between Giza and Saqqara, and almost no one comes to see them. The road that leads to the site is unpaved. The signage is minimal. The facilities are non-existent. A visitor who makes the journey will find a cluster of ruined mounds rising from the sand, their casings stripped, their cores exposed, their original geometric precision dissolved into the irregular contours of natural erosion. From a distance, they could be mistaken for hills. From close up, they reveal themselves as the remains of monuments that were once covered in gleaming white limestone, and that now display, with unflinching honesty, the rubble that was always there, hidden behind the polished surface, waiting to be exposed. The question this documentary began with was simple. What are the Pyramids of Abusir, and why have they been forgotten? The answer has turned out to be far more complex and far more consequential than the question suggested. The Pyramids of Abusir are the monuments of the Fifth Dynasty of Egypt, a dynasty that presided over one of the most important transitions in the history of human civilization, the transition from monumental construction to institutional management. from concentrated output to distributed complexity, from solid stone to rubble fill. They have been forgotten because they are not visually impressive, because their ruined condition makes them poor candidates for tourism, and because the cultural bias that leads us to judge civilizations by the size and permanence of their monuments has blinded us to the significance of their institutional achievements. But Abusir should not be forgotten. It should be remembered as one of the most important archaeological sites in Egypt, not despite its ruined pyramids, but because of them. The rubble-fill cores, exposed by the removal of the limestone casings, are the most honest monuments in the entire Egyptian archaeological record. They do not pretend. They do not deceive. They show with brutal clarity what lies behind the facade of monumental permanence: compromise, adaptation, the pragmatic substitution of cheap materials for expensive ones, the rational response of practical builders to the reality that the resources available for construction had been redirected to other purposes. The rubble is not a secret, it is a confession, and the confession it makes, that the most visible achievements of a civilization can conceal fundamental compromises in quality and substance, is a confession that every mature civilization needs to hear. The Abusir Papyri, stored in archives in Prague and Cairo, continue to yield new information with each decade of scholarly study. The fragments that have been published represent only a portion of the total corpus, and the work of reading, interpreting, and contextualizing these documents will occupy specialists for generations to come. Each new fragment that is deciphered adds another detail to the picture of Old Kingdom administration, another duty roster, another offering list, another inspection report, another small piece of the vast institutional puzzle that the Fifth Dynasty created and that the desert preserved. The papyri are, in their own way, as monumental as the pyramids. They record the operation of a system of such complexity and such precision that it makes the rubble-fill pyramids it served seem almost irrelevant. The system was the real achievement. The pyramids were its byproduct. And the fact that the byproduct has crumbled while the documentation has survived is itself the most eloquent comment on the relative durability of stone and paper that the ancient world has produced. The direct answer to the title's implicit question, "Why are the Pyramids of Abusir the Forgotten Royal Necropolis?" is that they are forgotten because they are visually unimpressive, because they are ruined beyond the point of casual recognition, because they do not meet our expectations of what a royal necropolis should look like, and because the cultural framework through which we evaluate ancient civilizations values visual spectacle over institutional achievement and monumental scale over administrative sophistication. But the deeper answer is that they are forgotten because they tell an uncomfortable truth, a truth about the gap between appearance and reality, between the polished surface and the compromised core, between the efficiency of the system and the quality of the output. We prefer not to look at that gap. We prefer the gleaming casings. We prefer the illusion of solidity. We prefer the story in which the pyramids are eternal, and the civilization that built them was uniformly great across every dimension of achievement. The rubble tells a different story, a more complicated story, a story of trade-offs and compromises and rational adaptations that produced monuments that were never as solid as they appeared, and institutions that were more impressive than anyone realized until the papyri were found. It is not a story we want to hear, but it is a story we need to hear because the dynamics it documents are not ancient. They are present, they are active, they are operating right now behind the polished casings of our own civilization's most impressive achievements, in every institution that measures its success by the sophistication of its management rather than the quality of its output, in every system that has confused procedural excellence with substantive performance, in every structure that looks solid from the outside and that no one has thought to inspect from within. The Abusir Papyri contain a phrase that appears repeatedly in the inspection reports filed by the officials who examined the temple complexes. The phrase, rendered in translation, reads roughly as found in order. It was the bureaucratic stamp of approval, the certification that the temple was functioning properly, that the offerings had been made, that the priests had served their shifts, that the equipment was intact, that the accounts balanced, found in order, the system was in order, the paperwork was in order, the institution was in order, and inside the pyramid that the institution served, the core was rubble, found in order. It is the epitaph of the Fifth Dynasty. It could be the epitaph of any civilization that has perfected the art of institutional management, while losing sight of the substance that the institutions were created to manage. The wind blows across the Abusir plateau. The sand drifts into the exposed cores of pyramids that were sealed behind white limestone 4,500 years ago, and that have been crumbling slowly and steadily and without interruption since the day the casing was removed. The rubble shifts. A block loosens and slides down the slope of the ruined core, coming to rest in the sand at the base of the monument with a soft sound that no one hears. No one has watched these pyramids fall for centuries. They stand alone in the desert, halfway between the glory of Giza and the antiquity of Saqqara, overlooked by tourists, undervalued by popular culture, and quietly yielding to anyone patient enough to excavate them. Some of the most important evidence for the inner workings of the ancient Egyptian state that has ever been recovered from the sands of the Nile Valley. Somewhere in Prague, in a climate-controlled archive at Charles University, a fragment of papyrus from the temple of Neferirkare records the delivery of 14 loaves of bread and 7 jars of beer to the morning of a king whose pyramid is now a mound of rubble in the Egyptian desert. The bread was consumed on the day it was delivered. The beer was drunk by priests whose names are recorded in the same archive. In other fragments from the same collection, men who served their monthly shifts and went home and lived their lives and died and were buried in tombs that have themselves crumbled into the sand. The offering was made, the ritual was completed, the account was filed, the system worked efficiently and professionally, and with meticulous attention to administrative detail. And the pyramid, the eternal monument that the entire system existed to serve and to sustain, stands in the desert sun with its rubble exposed to the sky, its casing gone, its secret revealed, its compromise visible to anyone who is willing to make the journey to the Forgotten Necropolis between Giza and Saqqara and look at what the desert has uncovered. The pyramids stand, the casings are gone, the rubble is exposed, the papyri endure, and the silence that surrounds the ruins of Abusir, the deep and permanent silence of a place that has been overlooked and underestimated and dismissed as insignificant for generations, is not the silence of a place that has nothing to say. It is the silence of a place that has been saying something important for 4,500 years. Something about the relationship between systems and structures, between institutions and achievements, between the visible and the invisible, between the casing and the core, and that has been waiting, with the patient indifference of the desert itself, for someone to listen. The Pyramids of Abusir are the Forgotten Royal Necropolis. They deserve to be remembered, not for their beauty, which is gone, not for their grandeur, which they never possessed, but for the truth they tell, the uncomfortable, unglamorous, unflattering truth about what happens inside the monuments of a civilization that has perfected the art of looking solid from the outside while filling its foundations with rubble.